I never told my mother-in-law what I did in the army. She smirked as I walked into the courthouse holding my child, confident that she was about to take everything from me. "You do not stand a chance against us," she whispered with a cruel smile. That smug look vanished the moment the judge took his seat, looked directly at me and said, "Good morning, Colonel." The color completely drained from her face as she stammered, "You are a colonel." Before I reveal exactly how I dismantled their fake dynasty, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your true worth. My name is Julia Lawson, and I am 34 years old. For the past 7 years, I allowed my wealthy in-laws to believe I was nothing more than a low-level government administrative assistant. It was easier that way, a necessary cover for my actual career, and a quiet way to keep the peace for the sake of my marriage to Bradley. But today, standing in the polished marble hallway of the Boston family court, that peace was officially over. I squeezed the small, warm hand of my 6-year-old daughter, Lily, who was clutching her favorite stuffed bear against her chest. Her bright green eyes darted around the echoing corridor, sensing the tension that hung heavy in the air. We had arrived early, intentionally trying to find a quiet corner before the legal proceedings began. My heart ached for Lily. She was too young to understand the ugly custody battle her father had initiated, too innocent to grasp how vicious her own grandmother could be. I smoothed down the lapels of my modest gray blazer, taking a deep breath of the sterile courthouse air. Just as I knelt to fix her collar, the heavy wooden doors at the end of the hall swung open. Catherine Lawson marched toward us, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. At 60 years old, my mother-in-law was a vision of expensive hostility. She wore a tailored designer suit that probably cost more than some people earned in a year, and her posture screamed of entitlement. She was the matriarch of what she constantly referred to as a Boston dynasty, a family built on generational wealth, and a deeply ingrained belief that money could buy anything, including children. Catherine did not come alone. She flanked my path, deliberately blocking the space between me and the courtroom entrance. I stood up slowly, keeping Lily safely positioned behind my legs. Catherine did not offer a greeting. She did not even glance at her granddaughter. Instead, she reached into her oversized designer handbag, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and threw it forcefully onto the wooden bench beside me. The heavy packet landed with a loud thud that echoed down the hallway. "Take a good look at that," Julia Catherine said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. I glanced down at the envelope. Printed boldly across the front was the logo of one of the most expensive family law firms in Massachusetts. It was an itemized legal bill detailing every hour of litigation her high-priced attorneys had spent building a fraudulent case against me. $85,000, Catherine stated, crossing her arms over her chest. "That is what you owe for dragging out this custody dispute. That is what it costs to fight the Lawson family." I kept my face entirely neutral, refusing to give her the reaction she desperately craved. She wanted to see me crumble. She wanted to see the poor, struggling civil servant break down in tears right here in the public hallway. "I have a very simple proposition for you," Catherine continued, taking a step closer, her expensive perfume suffocating the air between us. "You sign the papers today, granting Bradley full physical and legal custody of Lily. You pack your cheap bags, and you walk away. If you do that right now, before we step foot in front of the judge, I will personally pay this entire $85,000 debt. You can walk out of here free and clear, without being completely financially destroyed." I looked at the woman who had spent years making snide comments about my background. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering mockingly on my plain gray blazer and standard-issue black flats. "Look at yourself, Julia," she sneered. "You are a glorified filing clerk. You make a pathetic government salary pushing papers at some dreary desk. How exactly do you plan to fight a family with our resources? You do not even have a lawyer present today. You are completely out of your depth, and you have absolutely no business fighting a dynasty." Before I could respond to her absurd ultimatum, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom opened again. Bradley stepped out, adjusting his expensive silk tie. My ex-husband was 35 years old, handsome in a polished, completely superficial way, and entirely dependent on the approval of his mother. He walked over to stand shoulder to shoulder with Catherine, puffing out his chest as he looked down at me. "Mom is offering a generous way out," Bradley said, his voice loud to attract the attention of passing clerks. "You should take it. You are in no position to raise a child anyway." I tightened my grip on her hand. "I provide a stable, loving home for my daughter," I replied evenly, keeping my tone steady and calm. Stable, Bradley scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. "Do not make me laugh. You vanish for weeks at a time on those sketchy administrative business trips of yours. You leave your husband to play single father while you fly off to God knows where to take meeting minutes for low-level government bureaucrats. You abandoned your family for your pathetic little job. A mother who constantly disappears on pointless trips deserves absolutely nothing." His words were sharp, designed to humiliate me and reinforce his lies. Bradley truly believed my deployments were just boring secretarial trips. He truly believed that I was just sitting in a drab cubicle taking dictation. He had no idea about the massive cyber intelligence operations I directed, or the fact that my sketchy business trips involved neutralizing international threats to the United States power grid. He just saw a woman who refused to stay home and play the obedient, dependent wife. Catherine placed a hand on the arm of Bradley, smiling like a predator closing in on its prey. She looked back at me, her eyes filled with absolute certainty that she had won. "We have everything we need to ruin you in there," she whispered, pointing a manicured finger toward the courtroom. "The private investigators, the financial records, everything. So be a good little clerk, Julia. Pick up that envelope, sign the custody surrender, and disappear back into your mediocre life before the judge destroys whatever future you have left." I looked down at the thick manila envelope sitting on the wooden bench. I looked at Bradley, puffed up with unearned arrogance, and then at Catherine, swimming in her delusions of grandeur. I let go of her hand for just a moment, reaching out to calmly pick up the heavy packet of legal bills. I weighed it in my hands, feeling the physical representation of their hubris. Then, moving with deliberate slowness, I held the envelope out and pressed it firmly back into the chest of Catherine. She stumbled back a half step in surprise, instinctively grabbing the paper. "I never said I could not afford a lawyer, Catherine," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, lethal register that made her smirk falter. "I said I did not need one to dismantle you." Before she could process the cold certainty in my eyes, the heavy brown wooden doors finally swung wide open. The bailiff stepped out into the hallway, looking directly at our group. "We are ready for you right now," he announced with a nod. I took her hand again and walked straight into the lion den. The Boston family court was a grand theater of polished mahogany wood and high vaulted ceilings. I guided Lily to the front row of the gallery seating, where a court-appointed child advocate was waiting with a gentle smile and crayons. I watched my daughter clutching her worn teddy bear tightly against her chest. I kissed the top of her head before stepping past the low wooden gate. I took my seat at the respondent table. I set my small pocket notebook and black pen on the bare surface. I sat, keeping my posture perfectly straight. To my immediate left, the plaintiff table was a spectacle of preparation. Richard Caldwell, the family attorney Catherine hired, was spreading out his arsenal. He wore his extremely expensive hourly rate like a weapon. He arranged 6 thick binders across the massive wooden table, making sure the gold-embossed labels faced my direction. Each spine was meticulously labeled with aggressive titles designed to intimidate. He caught me looking and offered a predatory grin, revealing whitened teeth that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He leaned over, tapping a stack of financial affidavits displaying a heavy gold watch. He looked like a hungry shark cornering a wounded seal in the shallow water waiting to strike. Bradley took his seat beside Caldwell, exuding the smug confidence of a man who believed the game was rigged in his favor. He adjusted his cuffs, casting a disdainful glance at my empty side of the table. Catherine sat directly behind them in the first row of the gallery, close enough to lean over the wooden partition. She positioned herself to ensure I could feel her presence breathing down my neck. She crossed her legs, smoothing her designer skirt while glaring at the back of my head. The air grew thick with tension. Caldwell did not wait for the judge to take the bench before starting his psychological warfare. He leaned across the aisle, bridging the gap between our tables. "You really should have taken the deal," Julia Caldwell said, his voice a low theatrical rumble meant to rattle me. "Fighting a family like the Lawsons without legal representation is procedural suicide. I am going to paint you as a negligent flight risk, and by the time I am finished, the court will not even grant you supervised weekend visits." I did not react. I picked up my pen, opened my notebook to a blank page, and wrote down the time. My silence irritated him. He scoffed, turning back to his files, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn child. The bailiff cleared his throat, signaling the imminent arrival of the judge, but Catherine could not resist twisting the knife one last time. She leaned forward, bringing her face close to the ear of Bradley. She spoke in a loud whisper designed for my benefit. "Let her act brave," Catherine hissed, her voice dripping with malice. "She is going to leave here with nothing but the clothes on her back and that pathetic notebook. I want you to push for full legal fees too, Bradley. She needs to be completely ruined so she never comes back into our lives." Bradley nodded eagerly, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Do not worry, Mom. Richard has it all covered. She will be lucky if she gets to send a Christmas card." Their arrogance filled the room with suffocating pressure. For 7 years, I swallowed my pride, playing the quiet, unremarkable government employee just to keep the peace. Bradley spent our entire marriage convinced he was the anchor of our family, treating my career like a cute little hobby. He constantly complained about my sudden administrative trips, claiming my absence forced him to play the single father. He loved telling his country club friends how difficult it was being married to a woman who chose filing paperwork over attending charity galas. I kept writing in my notebook, recording the exact phrasing of the threats Catherine muttered. I had faced hostile interrogators in war zones who possessed more tactical discipline than these spoiled socialites. Let them talk. Let them build their towering house of cards based on fabricated victimhood. They had no idea the foundation was already rigged with explosives. "All rise," the bailiff shouted, breaking through the smug murmurs at the plaintiff table. The side door behind the bench swung open, and Judge Thomas Reynolds walked into the courtroom. He was a man in his early 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a posture commanding immediate respect. He moved with a crisp, deliberate discipline I recognized instantly. You did not get that kind of bearing sitting in a country club. You got it from decades of military service. He took his seat, setting a thick stack of manila folders down with a heavy thud. "Be seated." Judge Reynolds commanded, his voice carrying a natural authority that required no amplification. Caldwell was on his feet before the judge fully settled. He buttoned his jacket, projecting his voice to fill the room. "Good morning, Your Honor." Caldwell began, flashing his charismatic smile. "We are here today requesting an emergency permanent custody transfer for my client, Bradley Lawson. As you can see from the documentation submitted, the respondent, Julia Lawson, is a flight risk. She is a negligent mother who routinely abandons her husband and child for weeks to pursue a low-level clerical job. We intend to prove that her erratic behavior, unstable living conditions, and complete lack of parental focus present an immediate danger to the physical and emotional well-being of her 6-year-old daughter." Caldwell paused, gesturing grandly toward my empty table. "Furthermore, Your Honor, I would like the court to note that the respondent has not bothered to secure legal counsel. She shows a complete disregard for the severity of these proceedings. We respectfully ask the court to act swiftly today to protect this child from a mother who is entirely unfit." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded over my notebook. I did not object. I did not interrupt. I let Caldwell dig the hole as deep as he possibly could. Judge Reynolds did not respond to the fiery opening statement. He did not nod. He did not look at Bradley, who was attempting to squeeze out a single tragic tear for the court record. Judge Reynolds completely ignored the theatrical display happening at the plaintiff table. Instead, he reached for a specific folder sitting on the very top of his docket. It was not the glossy, heavily indexed binders Caldwell had submitted. It was a plain, stark white folder bearing the official seal of the Department of Defense. I watched the hands of the judge as he opened the cover. I knew exactly what was inside that file. My commanding officer at Fort Meade personally ensured that my redacted background file was securely couriered directly to the chambers of Judge Reynolds this morning. It was a highly unusual procedure for a family court dispute, but this was an unusual situation involving an intelligence officer handling classified national security assets. The courtroom was silent. Caldwell stood at his table, his confident smile melting into a confused frown as he waited for the judge to acknowledge his opening remarks. Bradley shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at his mother for reassurance. Catherine gave him a tight nod. Judge Reynolds flipped the first page of the dossier. The only sound was the crisp rustle of thick paper turning. The first page was standard protocol identifying my clearance level and active duty status. It was the second page holding the real weight. I watched the eyes of Judge Reynolds carefully. As he scanned the second page, his brow furrowed. The casual, neutral expression of a family court judge dealing with a routine custody battle vanished entirely. His eyes narrowed, focusing intently on the thick black redacted bars and the unredacted paragraphs detailing my current operational command. He stopped reading and looked up. The silence stretched tight, pulling the air from the room until it felt like a heavy vacuum. He slowly closed the folder, letting his gaze drift past the grinning lawyer and the smug husband before finally locking his steady eyes directly onto mine. The courtroom remained incredibly still for a long moment. Judge Reynolds did not say a word about what he had just read. He simply adjusted his glasses and rested his hands on the polished wood of his bench. He gave me a brief, imperceptible nod before returning his attention to the plaintiff table. "Counsel, you may proceed with your petition," the judge said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Richard Caldwell took that as his cue to take center stage. He stepped out from behind his massive wooden table, adjusting the lapels of his tailored suit. He walked toward the center of the room, moving with the exaggerated swagger of a man who believed he had already won the case. He carried a thick stack of printed documents, resting them gently on the podium before turning to address the bench. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of stability and resources," Caldwell began, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "We are here to discuss the best interests of a 6-year-old child, a child who requires a dependable foundation." He paused for dramatic effect, turning to look at Bradley. "My client, Bradley Lawson, is the definition of stability. He is a respected vice president at a premier Boston financial firm. He has a pristine record, a substantial income, and the full, unwavering support of his prominent extended family." Caldwell smiled, gesturing toward Catherine, who sat in the gallery with her head held high, soaking in the praise like a sponge. Caldwell then turned his gaze toward me, and his smile curled into a sneer of utter contempt. "On the other hand, we have the respondent, Julia Lawson." He picked up the top document from his stack and waved it in the air like a victorious flag. "I have submitted Exhibit A for your review, Your Honor. These are the documented financial records of the respondent, including tax returns and recent bank statements." I watched as the bailiff took a copy of the paperwork and handed it up to the bench. I knew exactly what those papers showed. They were carefully curated, heavily manipulated documents designed to tell a very specific and very false story. According to these official records, Caldwell continued pacing slowly back and forth across the floor. "The respondent is currently employed as a mid-level administrative contractor for a government agency. Her reported income is a meager $42,000 a year. That is barely enough to maintain a single-bedroom apartment in this city, let alone provide for the complex needs of a growing child." Caldwell leaned casually against the wooden podium, shaking his head with a manufactured look of deep concern. "Your Honor, this woman claims she can provide a stable life for her daughter, but the math simply does not support her delusions. A mother who earns $42,000 a year cannot realistically sustain the lifestyle this child is accustomed to. She cannot afford the extracurricular activities, the healthcare costs, or the basic standard of living that my client has always provided. She is financially destitute. Caldwell walked back to the plaintiff table and placed a reassuring hand on the shoulder of Bradley. Bradley looked down at his lap, trying to project the image of a humble, heartbroken father. My client has been the sole provider for this family since the day the child was born, Caldwell proclaimed, his voice growing louder with righteous indignation. He is the golden boy of the Boston finance world. He paid the mortgage on their beautiful home. He paid for the groceries, the clothing, and the expensive pediatric dental bills. He single-handedly kept a roof over the head of his daughter while the respondent was busy playing filing clerk. Caldwell turned his back to me completely, addressing only the judge. Imagine the trauma this child will face if she is ripped away from the financial security of the Lawson family and forced into poverty. Imagine her being dragged down into a life of constant struggle simply because her mother refuses to accept her own severe limitations. Catherine nodded vigorously in the gallery, murmuring her agreement just loud enough for the court reporter to catch the sound. I watched Bradley wipe a non-existent tear from his eye. It was a masterclass in deception. They truly believed they could crush me with a few spreadsheets and a loud, aggressive lawyer. They thought my silence was submission. They thought my lack of an attorney meant I was defenseless and terrified. I picked up my pen and tapped it softly against my notebook. I took a slow, deep breath, gathering my thoughts before breaking the silence. Objection, Your Honor. I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying easily across the large room. The financial narrative Mr. Caldwell is presenting is entirely fabricated and deliberately misleading. Caldwell spun around, his face flushing with immediate anger. He opened his mouth to shout me down, but Judge Reynolds raised a single hand, silencing the lawyer instantly. The judge looked at me, his expression unreadable but attentive. You may explain your objection, Ms. Lawson, the judge instructed. I stood up from my chair, making sure my posture was perfectly straight. I looked directly at Caldwell and then at my ex-husband. Bradley suddenly looked a little less confident. Mr. Caldwell claims I am financially destitute. I began, maintaining a calm and measured tone. What he conveniently omitted from his dramatic presentation is the fact that Bradley illegally locked me out of all our joint banking accounts exactly 3 months ago. He transferred every single dollar of our shared marital assets into a private offshore trust controlled by his mother. He canceled my credit cards and restricted my access to the funds I helped accumulate. He did this specifically to artificially create this exact narrative of poverty for the court today. The courtroom felt incredibly tense. Catherine shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her manicured fingers gripping the wooden partition in front of her. Caldwell let out a loud, mocking laugh, waving his hand dismissively in the air. This is ridiculous, Your Honor, Caldwell sneered. The respondent is making wild, baseless accusations to cover up her own financial incompetence. She has no proof of these supposed hidden accounts because they do not exist. She is a low-level contractor who cannot manage her own life. He leaned aggressively over the podium, pointing a finger directly at me. Let me be very clear here, Julia. Excuses do not pay for private school. Excuses do not put food on the table. You are broke, and you have absolutely no means to support this child. Caldwell turned to the bench, looking satisfied with his cruel speech. He straightened his posture and adjusted his tie, projecting absolute victory. Your Honor, the facts are undeniable, Caldwell stated with confidence. The plaintiff is a stable and devoted father. The respondent is a financially ruined woman who cannot even afford legal representation today. I am officially asking the court to rule immediately based on the clear lack of financial stability on the part of the mother. We petition for a permanent custody order in favor of Bradley Lawson, effective immediately. Judge Reynolds looked down at the documents Caldwell had submitted and then slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. I did not show an ounce of fear. I reached down to the seat beside me and picked up a single sealed black folder. It was unmarked except for a small numeric code printed in the upper right corner. I walked calmly out from behind the respondent table, my black flats making no sound on the floor. Caldwell watched me with a mixture of confusion and lingering disdain. I approached the bailiff and slid the black folder smoothly across his desk. The bailiff picked it up and carried it up to the bench, placing it directly in front of the judge. I looked over at Catherine, who was suddenly gripping her designer purse with white knuckles. Then I looked at the expensive lawyer who thought he had won the war. "Your Honor," I said, my voice echoing with absolute quiet authority, "I believe the financial assessment prepared by Mr. Caldwell is missing a few clearances." Caldwell scoffed loudly, slapping his hand against the wooden table. "Your Honor, this is yet another desperate stalling tactic," he declared, his voice booming through the courtroom. "The respondent is attempting to distract this court with mysterious folders and vague claims about clearances to avoid answering for her own inadequacies. I ask that you set that aside for a moment, because the financial instability of the respondent is only the tip of the iceberg. We have far more pressing matters regarding the immediate physical safety of the minor child." Judge Reynolds kept his hand resting on the sealed folder I had submitted. He looked at Caldwell with an unreadable expression. "Proceed, Mr. Caldwell." The judge instructed, his tone carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. Caldwell snapped his fingers. His assistant sprinted to set up a projector, aiming the lens at the wall beside the witness stand. Caldwell walked over to his files and pulled out a red binder. He held it up. "For the past 2 months, my client and his family have been deeply concerned about the erratic behavior of the respondent," Caldwell announced, pacing. "They hired a private investigator to observe her activities, hoping to find some reasonable explanation for her absences. What they found instead is deeply disturbing and completely disqualifies her from retaining any custody of the minor child." I glanced at the gallery seating. Catherine was sitting perfectly straight, her hands resting elegantly on her designer handbag. Bradley mirrored her smug posture, leaning back comfortably in his chair. They were absolutely convinced that whatever Caldwell was about to show the judge would be the final nail in my coffin. "Your Honor, we are submitting Exhibit B into evidence," Caldwell said, pressing a button on a remote control. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly and a high-definition photograph flashed onto the wall. The image was grainy, taken with a night vision lens, but the subject was unmistakable. It was me. I was standing on the sidewalk outside my apartment complex. It was pitch black outside, and I was wearing a heavy dark trench coat with the collar pulled up against the biting wind. I was holding a discreet duffel bag and stepping into the back seat of an unmarked black SUV with tinted windows. Caldwell pressed the button on his remote again. A second photograph appeared. This one showed me in a different location, a dimly lit parking garage. Again, it was the middle of the night. 2 large men wearing dark suits and discreet earpieces were standing on either side of me as I climbed into the back of another identical black SUV. He clicked through 3 more photographs in rapid succession. Each one showed specific variations of the exact same scene. Me leaving my home or an obscure location at odd hours of the night, being ushered into unmarked black vehicles by large, intimidating men whose faces were obscured by the shadows. Caldwell let the final image rest on the wall. He turned to the judge, his face a mask of grave concern. "Your Honor, the respondent has claimed that her sudden disappearances are due to administrative government work. But I ask you to look at these photographs. Does this look like the behavior of an administrative clerk? Does an office assistant get picked up in the dead of night by unmarked vehicles and men who look like hired muscle?" Caldwell walked closer to my table, his voice dripping with condescension. "We have documented evidence of Julia Lawson engaging in suspicious activities. She vanishes into the night with strange men. We do not know where she goes. We do not know what activities she is involved in. But we do know that these are not the actions of a stable mother. Is she involved with a criminal syndicate? Is she carrying on illicit affairs with dangerous individuals who could bring harm to her 6-year-old daughter? We do not know because she refuses to be transparent about her activities." A loud, dramatic gasp echoed through the courtroom. I did not have to turn around to know it was Catherine. She had placed her manicured hand over her chest, clutching her pearl necklace as if she were about to faint from the horror of the revelation. "Oh, my poor innocent granddaughter," Catherine whispered loudly, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "How could she expose our family to such dangerous criminal elements? The bailiff shot a warning look toward the gallery, but Catherine ignored him, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk tissue. Bradley seized his cue, shaking his head in disgust. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his table. "I tried to tell you, Your Honor," Bradley said. "I tried to warn everyone. She is erratic. She leaves in the middle of the night without telling anyone where she is going. I spent time worrying that these thugs would show up at our doorstep while my daughter was sleeping. She is a danger to herself and to Lily. I cannot in conscience allow my child to be in the care of a woman who runs around with criminals." Caldwell nodded, amplifying the performance of his client. The environment the respondent provides is not just financially deficient. Your Honor, it is physically hazardous. Caldwell proclaimed, his voice reaching a crescendo. She is exposing a vulnerable 6-year-old child to underworld elements. She is prioritizing her lifestyle over the safety and well-being of her blood. We are asking the court to immediately suspend all of her visitation rights, pending a full criminal investigation into these activities. I sat still at the respondent table, writing down the words Caldwell had used: criminal syndicate, underworld elements. I kept my face entirely neutral. I did not look angry. I did not look scared. I simply observed them as if they were a fascinating science experiment. My complete lack of reaction seemed to unnerve Caldwell. He had expected me to shout, to cry, to defend my reputation. He wanted me to look like the erratic, unstable woman he was describing to the court. Instead, I calmly turned the page of my notebook and waited. Judge Reynolds had remained silent during the presentation. He had watched the grainy photographs flash across the wall with a completely blank expression. He had listened to the accusations of Caldwell without interrupting. He had heard the gasp of Catherine and the pleading of Bradley. He did not say a single word in response. He lowered his gaze to the sealed black folder sitting on his desk. The secure folder I had personally provided. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. Catherine leaned forward in the gallery, eager to hear the judge issue his ruling against me. Bradley smirked at his lawyer, celebrating their perceived victory. Caldwell stood tall, waiting for the praise he felt he had earned for his legal work. Judge Reynolds slowly broke the seal on the black folder. He opened the cover. Inside was the redacted file authorized by the Department of Defense. It contained the details of the classified deployments Caldwell had described as a criminal syndicate. The judge carefully read the first long paragraph. He looked up at the screen on the wall, still displaying the night vision image of me getting into the unmarked black SUV. He looked closely at the men Caldwell had called thugs. Then the judge looked back down at the military paperwork resting in his hands. The silence in the room stretched, pulling the tension to a breaking point. Caldwell opened his mouth to press his advantage, to demand an immediate ruling in favor of his client. But before the lawyer could speak a word, Judge Reynolds let out a sound that no one in the room expected to hear. It started as a low rumble deep in his chest. Then it grew into a low, echoing chuckle. The unexpected sound of the judge laughing completely silenced the entire courtroom. The smirk vanished from the face of Bradley. Catherine dropped her silk tissue into her lap. Caldwell stood frozen at the podium, his mouth hanging open in confusion. The judge continued to chuckle, shaking his head as he read the second page of the classified dossier. The sound of the judge laughing abruptly shifted the atmosphere in the room from tense anticipation to utter confusion. Richard Caldwell gripped the edges of his wooden podium with white knuckles. He blinked rapidly, trying to process why his photographic evidence was being met with amusement by a seasoned family court judge. He cleared his throat loudly, attempting to reclaim the narrative. He needed to pivot back to the emotional core of his strategy. "Your Honor," Caldwell said, his voice tighter, now stripped of its previous warmth. "While the respondent may have some excuse for her bizarre nighttime behavior, we must return to the primary issue at hand: the severe emotional and physical neglect suffered by the minor child. I call Bradley Lawson to the stand." Judge Reynolds closed the black folder and rested his hands on top of it. He looked down at Caldwell with a lingering trace of amusement in his eyes, but nodded his permission. Bradley stood up, adjusting his navy blue suit. He shot a quick, reassuring glance toward his mother in the gallery. Catherine gave him a stiff, encouraging nod. Bradley walked to the witness stand with the practiced stride of a man used to commanding boardrooms. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and took his seat. He adjusted the microphone, making sure his posture was perfectly straight, but his shoulders sloped just enough to convey the heavy burden he supposedly carried. Caldwell approached the witness stand with a sympathetic smile. He clasped his hands together, speaking in a soft, gentle tone designed to paint his client as a long-suffering martyr. Mr. Lawson, Caldwell began slowly. Can you describe what the daily reality of your marriage has been like for the past few years? Bradley let out a long, weary sigh. He looked down at his hands resting on the wooden rail before raising his eyes. It has been incredibly difficult, Your Honor. Bradley said, his voice carrying a blend of exhaustion and manufactured sorrow. I am a vice president at a major financial firm. I have demanding hours. But for the past 5 years, I have essentially been a single father. I am the one who wakes up at dawn to make Lily her oatmeal. I manage her school drop-offs and attend every single parent-teacher conference alone. I read her bedtime stories while my wife is completely unreachable. He paused, letting the heavy silence amplify his supposed pain. I sat at my table, keeping my pen moving across the pages of my notebook. I recorded his lies word for word, maintaining a completely neutral expression. And where is the respondent during all of these daily routines? Caldwell prompted, acting as if he were pulling painful truths from a reluctant witness. Bradley shook his head, his features twisting into a mask of deep disappointment. She leaves for days or even weeks at a time for these endless administrative trips. She says she has to go file papers for mid-level government bureaucrats. She completely tunes out our family. Even when she is physically in the house, she is mentally absent. She locks herself in her office, refusing to engage with her own daughter. I have tried to be supportive. I really have. But I cannot do it all by myself anymore. I cannot keep pretending that Lily has a mother who cares about her. Caldwell nodded sympathetically, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. Let us talk about a specific instance, Mr. Lawson. A moment that truly illustrates the danger of this absence. Can you tell the court what happened last winter during the week of February 12th? Bradley took a sharp breath, gripping the railing. He closed his eyes, acting as if the memory was too traumatic to bear. It was a Tuesday evening. Bradley began, his voice trembling with a carefully calibrated edge of panic. Lily had been nursing a bad cold. I was home early from the office to take care of her because Julia had locked herself in her study, claiming she had a massive backlog of data entry. I was making chicken soup when I heard Lily coughing. It was a horrible, wet, rattling sound. I ran up to her bedroom and found her struggling to breathe. Her face was pale and her lips were turning blue. Her fever was spiking high. Caldwell stopped pacing, leaning against the podium. What did you do, Mr. Lawson? I panicked, Bradley said. I scooped her up in a thick blanket and ran straight down the hall to the locked door of the home office. I pounded on the door. I screamed that our daughter was suffocating, that we needed to go to the emergency room immediately. But Julia did not open the door. She just shouted through the wood that she was in the middle of something important and that I needed to handle it myself. Catherine gasped dramatically for the court record, clutching her pearls. I continued writing in my notebook, marveling at his audacity. It was a compelling story, but completely fabricated. I did not wait another second. Bradley continued, his voice cracking with emotion. I carried Lily out to my car in the freezing rain and sped to the emergency room. She was diagnosed with severe pneumonia. They had to put her on oxygen immediately. She was terrified. She kept crying and asking for her mother. I sat beside her hospital bed all night long, holding her tiny, feverish hand, repeatedly assuring her that everything was going to be fine and that her daddy would never leave her side. And where was the respondent while you were sitting in the intensive care unit with your terrified daughter? Caldwell asked, his voice booming with righteous anger. Did she eventually come to the hospital to comfort her child? Bradley looked directly at me, his eyes narrowing with a look of absolute disgust. No, he said sharply. I called her cell phone 20 times that night. I left frantic voicemails begging her to come to the hospital. She ignored every single one. The next morning, I found out from our neighbor that she had left the house shortly after I rushed Lily to the emergency room. She got into one of those unmarked black SUVs with those strange men and drove off into the night. She abandoned her critically ill child in a hospital bed to go on some secret joyride with her sketchy associates. Caldwell shook his head, turning to look at Judge Reynolds. A secret joyride while a 6-year-old child fights for her life in a hospital ward. This is the reality of the environment my client is trying to protect his daughter from. This is the definition of gross parental negligence. Bradley leaned forward in the witness chair, pointing a rigid finger directly at me. He raised his voice, ensuring every word echoed with furious indignation. She does not even care about her own flesh and blood. Bradley spat out, his face flushed with manufactured rage. She is cold. She is entirely absent. She is socially and morally unfit to be a mother. The courtroom was completely silent. The heavy accusations hung in the air, painting a devastating portrait of a monstrous mother who prioritized illicit midnight rides over the life of her sick child. Catherine sat back in the gallery, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. Caldwell returned to his table looking immensely satisfied. I stopped writing. I placed my black pen neatly beside my small pocket notebook on the respondent table. I took a slow, deep, steady breath, letting the heavy silence stretch for a few long seconds. I pushed my chair back and stood up, slowly smoothing the front of my gray blazer. I completely ignored the glaring eyes of my ex-husband and the arrogant smirk of his expensive lawyer. I ignored the toxic presence of my mother-in-law sitting just rows behind me. I looked directly at Judge Reynolds, who was watching me with calm, expectant eyes. He had closed the black folder and rested his clasped hands on top of it, patiently waiting for my response. Permission to address the plaintiff fairy tale. Your Honor, I politely asked. Judge Reynolds slowly reached up and removed his wire-rimmed glasses. He folded the arms with a sharp, deliberate click that echoed in the heavy silence. He placed them carefully on top of the stark white dossier resting on his elevated bench. He did not look at Richard Caldwell, who was still standing at his podium, practically vibrating with the arrogant certainty that he had just secured a total victory. He completely ignored Bradley, who was sitting in the witness stand, wiping away his manufactured tears and waiting for his inevitable vindication. Instead, Judge Reynolds looked past both of them. He locked his sharp, intelligent eyes directly onto mine. You have the floor, the judge said, his deep voice booming through the silent room, carrying an unmistakable tone of profound professional respect. Good morning, Colonel. The courtroom instantly froze. It was as if all the oxygen had been violently vacuumed out of the high-vaulted chamber. The confident, smug energy that had radiated from the plaintiff table simply vanished, evaporating into the cold air. In the gallery, directly behind the wooden partition, Catherine Lawson went perfectly rigid. The heavy gold designer pen she had been using to take meticulous notes slipped from her manicured fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence. It rolled beneath the barrier and came to a stop near the expensive Italian leather shoes of Richard Caldwell. On the witness stand, Bradley lost his composure entirely. The carefully practiced mask of the heartbroken single father melted away instantly, leaving behind the pale face of a deeply confused and suddenly terrified man. He gripped the wooden railing of the witness box, his knuckles turning stark white as he stared at the judge. Colonel Bradley stammered, his voice cracking and pitching upward in a highly undignified squeak. What is he talking about? What do you mean, Colonel? Caldwell gripped his podium, looking like a man who had just stepped onto a hidden landmine and heard the click. He whipped his head back and forth between the judge and me, his jaw working silently as he desperately tried to process the impossible title. He looked at the grainy night vision photographs still projected on the courtroom wall, showing me getting into the unmarked black SUVs, and then he looked back at the official government folder resting under the hands of the judge. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply stood up from my chair, making sure my posture was perfectly straight. I stood there absorbing the massive shockwaves radiating from their side of the room. For 7 long years, I had ironed the dress shirts of Bradley, packed his lunches, and listened to him endlessly belittle my administrative government job. I had endured the constant snide remarks from Catherine about my lack of ambition and my modest wardrobe. I had played the part of the unremarkable quiet wife because my actual career required absolute unyielding discretion. My silence had never been a sign of weakness. It had been an operational mandate. Now that mandate was officially lifted. Judge Reynolds completely ignored the panicked stammering of my ex-husband. He turned his full attention to the court clerk, a young woman sitting at a desk just below his bench. Madam Clerk, the judge instructed, handing down a single sheet of heavy bond paper from the classified folder. I am entering this partially declassified personnel file into the official court record. Please read the highlighted sections aloud for the benefit of the plaintiff and his counsel. Since they are so deeply concerned about the professional and financial stability of the respondent, they deserve to hear the absolute facts. The clerk took the paper with a trembling hand. She cleared her throat, her eyes widening slightly as she quickly scanned the document. She leaned forward, adjusting her microphone. The document is an official status verification from the United States Department of Defense. The clerk read, her voice echoing clearly through the courtroom speakers. It confirms that Julia Lawson is an active-duty military officer currently holding the rank of 06 Colonel in the United States Army. She is the commanding officer of a specialized division within United States Army Cyber Command. Bradley let out a sharp, strangled gasp. He slumped back against the hard wooden chair of the witness stand as if the wind had been knocked completely out of his lungs. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, his mouth hanging open. Colonel. I was a colonel. In his narrow, wealthy country club world, I was just a boring woman who pushed papers. He had spent our entire marriage lecturing me about corporate leadership and demanding I respect his position as a mid-level vice president. The sudden realization that I vastly outranked him in a massive theater of operations he could not even begin to comprehend was visibly breaking his mind. The clerk continued reading, her voice remaining steady and clear, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. Regarding financial stability, the document details the comprehensive compensation package of Colonel Lawson. This includes her base military pay, substantial hazardous duty pay, specialized security clearance allowances, and full housing subsidies. Combined with her classified operational stipends, her total verified annual income is approximately 4 times the amount currently reported by Mr. Bradley Lawson. Caldwell physically stumbled backward away from his podium. He looked down at the 6 thick binders of fabricated financial affidavits he had so proudly displayed on his massive wooden table. His entire legal argument built on the absolute premise that I was destitute and incapable of providing for Lily had just been completely incinerated. I did not make $42,000 a year. I made significantly more than the mighty Bradley Lawson and his elite financial firm could ever hope to pay him, and every single dime of my income was backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Furthermore, the clerk read, moving down to the final highlighted section of the page. The document clarifies the transportation arrangements previously called into question by the plaintiff. Due to the highly sensitive nature of her command and her top-secret security clearance, Colonel Lawson is required to adhere to strict security protocols. The unmarked black vehicles that transport her from her residence at irregular hours are official government transports. The individuals accompanying her are armed security personnel assigned directly by the Pentagon to ensure the safety of a high-value military asset during classified operational deployments. The clerk lowered this paper, placing it gently on her desk. The projector hummed quietly in the background, still displaying the grainy night vision image of the men Caldwell had loudly called underworld thugs. They were not criminals. They were highly trained federal agents assigned to protect me. The secret joyrides Bradley had wept about were actually emergency deployments to neutralize active national security threats. Judge Reynolds turned his heavy gaze toward the gallery seating. The mild amusement that had accompanied his earlier chuckle was completely gone. His eyes were cold, hard, and utterly merciless as they locked onto Catherine Lawson. She sat frozen in the front row, looking exactly like a terrified statue. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and visibly trembling. Her expensive designer suit and heavy pearl necklace offered absolutely no protection against the focused, furious stare of a federal judge. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on the polished wood of his bench. He spoke slowly, deliberately, letting the massive weight of his words sink deep into every single corner of the quiet room. It appears your private investigator has been illegally tailing a highly classified military officer, Mrs. Lawson. The arrogant matriarch who had spent years treating me like a worthless servant suddenly realized the catastrophic magnitude of her mistake. Hiring an investigator to stalk a civilian was merely invasive. Stalking a commanding military officer was a crime holding entirely devastating federal consequences. Caldwell practically collapsed into his heavy wooden chair. Bradley opened and closed his mouth soundlessly like a dying fish. The ambush was completely perfect and beautifully absolute, leaving them thoroughly ruined. Judge Reynolds nodded slowly, his eyes locked on mine. "Permission granted, Colonel," he said, his voice carrying a quiet but absolute authority. "You may proceed." Panic immediately set in at the plaintiff table. Richard Caldwell dropped back into his heavy leather chair as if the strength had been completely severed from his legs. He scrambled blindly through his meticulously organized binders, knocking a stack of papers onto the floor. His hands shook as he searched for some kind of legal loophole, some procedural objection that could stop what was happening. But he had nothing. His entire strategy relied on painting me as a fragile, helpless woman, and that illusion had just been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Beside him, Bradley looked as though he might physically be sick. He kept swallowing hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the gallery. Catherine Lawson could not handle the sudden loss of control. The matriarch of the Lawson family was accustomed to commanding every room she entered, dictating the narrative with her wealth and sheer force of will. Seeing her son exposed and her expensive lawyer rendered entirely speechless pushed her over the edge. She stood up abruptly, her expensive heels scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. She gripped the wooden partition separating the gallery from the court, her knuckles turning bone-white under the strain. "Rank does not make her a good mother," Catherine shouted, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing off the high vaulted ceiling. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at my back. "I do not care what kind of uniform she wears or what classified government games she plays. She still abandoned my granddaughter in the ICU last winter. She left a terrified 6-year-old child alone in a hospital bed to go play soldier. Mrs. Lawson, you will seat yourself immediately, or the bailiff will remove you from this courtroom." Judge Reynolds warned, his voice cracking like a whip. "This is a court of law, not a country club luncheon. One more outburst and you will be held in contempt." Catherine slowly lowered herself back onto the wooden bench, her chest heaving with indignation. She glared at the back of my head, breathing heavily, but remaining silent. The judge turned his attention back to me. He steepled his fingers, resting his chin against his hands. "Colonel Lawson," the judge said, his tone softening just a fraction. "The plaintiff has made a specific and highly damaging accusation regarding an incident in February involving the hospitalization of your daughter. The court requires clarity on this matter. How do you respond to the claim that you abandoned your critically ill child?" I stepped out from behind the respondent table. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, disciplined stride of an officer who had faced down significantly more dangerous threats than a panicked socialite and a cowardly ex-husband. I reached into the pocket of my gray blazer and pulled out a small, encrypted silver USB drive. I walked over to the desk of the court clerk and gently placed the drive on the polished surface. "I would like to submit Exhibit C into evidence, Your Honor," I stated calmly. "Let us review the tape from that night at the ICU, shall we?" Judge Reynolds nodded to the clerk. She picked up the drive and inserted it into the court computer port. Caldwell protested weakly from his table, mumbling an objection about unverified evidence, but his voice lacked any real conviction. The judge silenced him with a single sharp look. "Your Honor, the plaintiff has characterized my departure that night as a secret joyride." I began, turning to face the judge completely. I was not out for a joyride. At 2100 hours on the night in question, our defense networks detected a coordinated, aggressive foreign cyber attack, targeting a major United States regional power grid. Had that attack breached the final firewall, millions of homes, including hospitals, nursing facilities, and emergency response centers, would have lost power in the dead of winter. Lives would have been lost. The operation required an immediate, rapid response deployment. As the commanding officer of the division, I was legally and morally obligated to respond. I turned slightly to look at Bradley, who was now sinking lower into the witness chair, his face slick with nervous sweat. I did not abandon my daughter. I continued, my voice steady and unwavering. I secured her in the care of the top pediatric respiratory specialists in the state. I deployed, I neutralized the threat to our national infrastructure, and the absolute second my operational mandate was complete, I returned to her side. The large screen on the courtroom wall flickered to life. The high-definition color video replaced the grainy black and white photographs Caldwell had used for his smear campaign. The security footage was clearly time-stamped, indicating the date and time as 3:42 in the morning. It showed the main corridor of the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Boston Children's Hospital. The hallway was brightly lit and quiet. I pointed to the screen. This footage was legally obtained through a standard subpoena from the Hospital Security Division, Your Honor, I explained. This is the exact moment I returned from my deployment. The court watched in total silence as the video played. On the screen, the heavy double doors at the end of the corridor burst open. A woman sprinted through them, moving with frantic, desperate speed. It was me. But I was not wearing an administrative pantsuit. I was wearing full operational combat fatigues. My tactical vest was still strapped over my chest. My boots hit the linoleum floor with heavy urgency. My hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and my face was pale with absolute exhaustion and terror for my child. The footage clearly showed me running past the nurse's station, ignoring the startled looks of the hospital staff, making a direct line for the room where Lily was being treated. I did not look like a cold, absent mother. I looked like a parent who had moved heaven and earth to get back to her sick baby. But that was not the part of the video that held the attention of the courtroom. The camera angle was wide, capturing the entire length of the hallway and the small waiting alcove located just outside the room of my daughter. Judge Reynolds leaned closer to his monitor, his brow furrowing as he studied the background of the security footage. There, sitting in the waiting alcove, was Bradley Lawson. He was not hovering anxiously by the bedside of his child, holding her feverish hand, as he had just tearfully claimed under oath. He was not consoling a terrified little girl who was struggling to breathe. Bradley was sitting comfortably on a plush hospital sofa. He had his phone pressed to his ear and his head thrown back in a wide, jovial laugh. The camera quality was high enough to capture the casual, relaxed posture of his body. He was leaning back, his legs crossed at the ankle, completely unbothered by the fact that his daughter was hooked up to an oxygen machine just 20 feet away. But the absolute worst part, the detail that completely destroyed his fabricated narrative of the devoted single father, was the object resting on the floor right next to his expensive leather loafers. It was a large, heavy canvas ski bag, clearly packed to the brim. Resting on top of the bag was a glossy printed itinerary for a luxury ski resort in Aspen. The video continued to play, showing me sprinting past Bradley. I did not even stop to acknowledge him on the footage. I just pushed through the heavy wooden doors to see my daughter. But the camera captured the exact moment Bradley noticed me. The smile vanished from his face instantly. He dropped his phone from his ear and quickly kicked the ski itinerary under the sofa, trying desperately to hide the evidence of his impending vacation. He had not rushed to the hospital to save his daughter. He had brought her to the emergency room because she was an inconvenience interfering with his planned ski trip. He was waiting for the nurses to stabilize her so he could leave her behind. His hypocrisy was now completely exposed to the room. The courtroom remained absolutely motionless. Every eye was glued to the large screen dominating the wall. The digital timestamp ticked forward second by second, painting an undeniably damning picture. In the foreground of the hospital security footage, the heavy doors to the pediatric intensive care unit had swung shut behind my sprinting figure. But the focus of the room had now completely shifted to the background. There, sitting comfortably on the waiting room sofa, was Bradley. The contrast between his relaxed posture and the critical medical emergency unfolding just down the hall was physically sickening to witness. Through the thick glass window of the intensive care room, a flurry of medical staff could be seen moving rapidly around the small bed where our 6-year-old daughter lay. Lily was hooked to monitors and oxygen lines, fighting through the terrifying grip of severe pneumonia. Even without sound, the visual of her small chest heaving with violent coughing fits was agonizing. Yet Bradley did not look through that glass once. He did not pace the hallway with parental worry. He did not ask the nurses for updates. He simply leaned further back into the cushions of the sofa, crossing his legs and holding his cell phone to his ear. His face was twisted into an ugly mask of pure irritation. He was gesturing wildly with his free hand, his mouth moving in rapid, angry bursts. He was clearly having a massive argument with whoever was on the other end of the line. The loving father, who had just wept on the witness stand, claiming he had spent the entire night holding the feverish hand of his critically ill child, was sitting 20 feet away, actively ignoring her existence. I stepped away from the clerk desk and walked slowly to the center of the room. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, allowing the devastating silence to stretch out, holding Bradley accountable for every agonizing second of his recorded negligence. I waited until the entire courtroom had fully digested the visual reality of his abandonment before I spoke again. "Your Honor," I said, my voice breaking the heavy quiet of the room. The video footage alone clearly contradicts the sworn testimony the plaintiff just provided to this court. However, visual evidence only tells half the story of that night. I request permission to play the accompanying audio track. Richard Caldwell finally found his voice. He jumped up from his chair, practically knocking it backward. "Objection, Your Honor." He shouted, his voice shrill and panicked. "Hospital security cameras do not typically record audio. We cannot verify the source or the legality of this recording. It is highly prejudicial and a clear violation of privacy statutes." I did not even look at Caldwell. I kept my gaze steady on Judge Reynolds. The audio was captured by the emergency room dispatch microphone positioned directly above the waiting alcove, Your Honor, I explained smoothly. It is standard hospital procedure to record audio in that specific dispatch zone for security and liability purposes. The recording was obtained legally under the same federal subpoena that provided the video footage. It has been fully authenticated and entered into the unsealed evidence folder, currently sitting on your bench. Judge Reynolds looked down at the dossier, then back up at Caldwell. His expression was cold and completely devoid of any sympathy for the crumbling lawyer. The evidence was legally obtained and properly submitted. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, his voice ringing with absolute finality, "your objection is overruled. You may sit down." Caldwell slowly lowered himself back into his seat, putting his head in his hands. He looked like a man who knew his career was flashing before his eyes. On the witness stand, Bradley was physically trembling. He looked frantically at the exit doors as if contemplating a desperate run for freedom, but he was completely trapped. Judge Reynolds nodded to the clerk. "Play the audio," he commanded. The clerk pressed a button on her keyboard, and a sharp burst of static crackled through the courtroom speakers, followed by the low ambient hum of the hospital waiting area. Then the voice of Bradley Lawson echoed through the cavernous room loudly and crystal clear. There was no trace of the soft, gentle tone he had used moments ago to paint himself as a long-suffering martyr. His recorded voice was harsh, whiny, and dripping with selfish entitlement. "I am telling you, I cannot just walk out right this second," Bradley spat, his voice filling the courtroom. "The nurses are running around everywhere. I have to wait until they stabilize her or someone will notice I am gone." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Several members of the jury physically recoiled, staring at Bradley with absolute disgust. But the audio recording was not finished. "No, you listen to me," the recorded voice of Bradley continued, his tone turning vicious. "I do not care that the kid is sick. I already booked our tickets to Cancun. Do you know how much money I spent on that resort? I am not losing my deposit just because Julia decided to vanish on another one of her stupid work trips. I will leave as soon as the doctor stops hovering. Just pack your bags and meet me at the airport terminal in an hour." The audio clicked off, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. On the screen, the visual played out exactly as he had promised his mistress. Bradley abruptly stood up from the hospital sofa. He stuffed his phone into his pocket and grabbed his heavy canvas bag from the floor. He did not walk over to the intensive care room to check on his daughter one last time. He did not speak to a single nurse or doctor to ensure she was stable. He simply turned his back on the pediatric ward, walked briskly down the long corridor, and pushed through the automatic exit doors, disappearing into the freezing winter night. He had left a critically ill 6-year-old child completely alone in a hospital, fighting to breathe so he could catch a flight to Mexico with his mistress. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from shocked disbelief to pure, unadulterated outrage. The jury box looked ready to riot. One of the female jurors was openly glaring at Bradley, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Another juror shook his head in absolute disgust, refusing to even look at the witness stand. Judge Reynolds sat perfectly still, his jaw set in a rigid line of fury. He stared at Bradley with a look of such profound contempt that it seemed to lower the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Bradley had tried to manipulate a federal judge by weaponizing the illness of a child, and the judge was clearly ready to bury him for it. Bradley hunched over in the witness chair, wrapping his arms around his stomach. He looked pathetic, small, and entirely broken. The tailored navy blue suit that had looked so commanding an hour ago now seemed like a cheap costume hanging off a coward. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of lie or excuse, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. I turned away from the screen and slowly walked back toward the gallery partition. I ignored Bradley completely. He was a defeated man, and he no longer mattered to me. Instead, I focused my entire attention on the woman sitting in the front row. Catherine Lawson was falling apart right in front of my eyes. The impeccable posture she had maintained for years was gone. She was slumped forward, clutching the wooden barrier with trembling hands. Her breath was coming in short, sharp, ragged gasps. She was hyperventilating, her carefully applied makeup looking stark and unnatural against her pale, sweating face. I stopped just a few short feet away from her, staring directly at the trembling matriarch. He did not stay by her bedside. Catherine, I stated, my voice remarkably smooth and razor-sharp. He used the $15,000 you gave him for medical bills to fly his new mistress to Mexico. Did he forget to mention that at our Sunday dinner? The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. The security footage remained frozen on the large screen, cementing the image of Bradley sitting comfortably in the waiting alcove, while our daughter fought for her life in the background. The devastating reality of his abandonment hung heavily in the cold air, completely suffocating the plaintiff's table. Catherine Lawson was falling apart right in front of my eyes. The impeccable posture she had maintained for years was gone. She was slumped forward, clutching the wooden barrier with trembling hands. Her breath was coming in short, sharp, ragged gasps. She was hyperventilating, her carefully applied makeup looking stark and unnatural against her pale, sweating face. Her designer suit seemed to swallow her shrinking frame. I stopped just a few short feet away from her, staring directly at the trembling matriarch. I kept my voice remarkably smooth and razor-sharp, ensuring it carried to every corner of the silent room. He did not stay by her bedside. Catherine, I stated slowly. He used the $15,000 you gave him for medical bills to fly his new mistress to Mexico. Did he forget to mention that at our Sunday dinner? Catherine stared at me, her mouth working silently as she tried to form words that refused to come. The color that had rushed to her face in anger suddenly drained completely away, leaving her looking frail and sick. She turned her head slowly toward the witness stand, fixing her gaze on her son. Bradley shrank back against the wooden panels of the box, trying to make himself as small as possible. He could not meet her eyes. His silence was a total, absolute confession. "Objection!" Richard Caldwell shouted suddenly, his voice cracking as he slammed his hands down onto his table. He practically leaped out of his chair, pointing wildly toward the large screen. "Your Honor, I move to strike this entire exhibit from the official record. This footage was ambushed upon us without proper discovery. Furthermore, the plaintiff cannot be held responsible for the emotional context of a video. I demand this be stricken and a recess be granted immediately." Judge Reynolds turned his furious gaze upon the lawyer. The heavy silence in the courtroom seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "You are demanding a recess, Mr. Caldwell?" the judge asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "You sit in my courtroom, present a fabricated narrative built entirely on malicious lies, present doctored financial affidavits, and attempt to weaponize the serious illness of a child. And now that your client has been caught committing absolute irrefutable perjury, you demand a recess. Caldwell swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. Your Honor, I had no knowledge of the specific circumstances surrounding the hospital incident. I was merely presenting the testimony as relayed by my client. Do not play games with me, Counselor. Judge Reynolds fired back, leaning over the bench. You are dangerously close to a charge of suborning perjury. You had a legal and ethical obligation to verify the claims your client was making, especially when they involved accusations of child abandonment. You built an entire case on a foundation of sand, and now you are upset that the tide has rolled in. Your objection is denied. The video and the audio remain in the official record. Sit down and do not speak again unless you are directly addressed by this court. Caldwell sank into his chair, looking thoroughly destroyed. He stared blankly at his immaculate legal pads, his expensive suit looking suddenly wrinkled and entirely useless. He did not look at Bradley. The alliance between the arrogant lawyer and the narcissistic client was officially broken. Judge Reynolds turned his attention back to me, taking a slow breath to steady his own anger. Colonel Lawson, the judge said, returning to the respectful title. Do you have any further evidence or witnesses to present regarding the financial standing and moral character of the plaintiff? I do, Your Honor, I replied, stepping back behind the respondent table. I have one witness to call. I call Special Agent Marcus Vance to the stand. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark charcoal suit walked down the center aisle. He carried a massive, thick black briefcase in his right hand. He did not look at the gallery or the plaintiff table. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, maintaining a completely neutral, professional expression. He walked through the swinging gate, stepped up to the witness stand, and raised his right hand to be sworn in. He took his seat, placing the heavy briefcase carefully onto the wooden ledge in front of him. Unlike Bradley, who had spent his entire testimony slouched and weeping, Special Agent Vance sat with perfect military posture. He looked exactly like what he was, a highly trained federal investigator. Good morning, Agent Vance. I began walking to the center of the floor. For the benefit of the court, could you please state your current occupation and your primary area of expertise? Good morning, Colonel Vance replied, his deep voice carrying easily across the room. I am a senior forensic accountant and lead digital investigator for the United States Department of Defense. My primary mandate involves tracking illicit financial movements, auditing high-level personnel, and uncovering hidden digital footprints across global networks. I nodded, pacing slowly. As a commanding officer in Cyber Command, my security clearance requires me to undergo rigorous routine financial audits to ensure I am not compromised or susceptible to foreign blackmail. Is that correct? That is correct, Colonel Vance affirmed. All high-level clearance personnel are subject to random, deep-dive financial scrutiny. Any unexplained anomalies in household income or sudden shifts in marital assets trigger an automatic internal investigation. And during a routine sweep of my household finances last spring, did your division discover any significant anomalies? I asked, letting the question hang in the air. We discovered massive anomalies, Vance stated bluntly, opening his thick black briefcase. He pulled out a staggering stack of bound documents, placing them squarely on the ledge. The dossier was easily 300 pages long, bound with heavy-duty clips and marked with bright red, confidential stamps. Caldwell stared at the stack of papers, looking like he wanted to slide under his table and disappear forever. Bradley was sweating profusely now, wiping his forehead with a shaking hand. Could you please explain what you found, Agent Vance? I asked, keeping my tone completely clinical. The plaintiff has presented several binders of financial affidavits claiming he is the sole provider for our household and that his income has barely kept our family afloat. He claims he has sacrificed his own financial stability to cover the massive debts I supposedly created. How do his sworn affidavits compare to your federal audit? They do not compare at all, Colonel Vance replied, pulling the top file from his stack. The financial affidavits presented by Mr. Lawson to this court are entirely fraudulent. Through my division, we initiated a comprehensive trace of his digital footprint. Every bank transfer, every wire, every hidden account was illuminated. We systematically mapped his complete financial history over the last 3 years. Vance put on a pair of reading glasses and looked down at the highlighted page. The plaintiff is certainly not struggling financially. Over the past 36 months, Mr. Lawson has been systematically draining your joint marital accounts. He funneled a total of $480,000 into 3 separate offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. The gallery erupted into shocked whispers. Judge Reynolds slammed his gavel down, once demanding immediate silence. Catherine Lawson pressed a hand over her mouth, staring at her son as if she was looking at a complete stranger. He utilized a series of dummy corporations and shell companies to hide these transfers. Vance continued, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He created fake invoices for supposed home repairs, childcare services, and legal consulting fees. He then authorized the transfer of funds from your joint accounts directly into these shell companies. He essentially paid himself almost $500,000 while simultaneously draining the accounts you use to manage the daily care of your daughter. I turned to look at Bradley. He was gripping the wooden rail so hard his fingers looked bruised. His face was a sickly shade of gray. He was leaning over, aggressively whispering something to Caldwell, but the lawyer simply shook his head and refused to look at him. Caldwell knew a federal audit was bulletproof. There was no cross-examination that could save them from the United States Department of Defense. So Mr. Lawson is not the struggling single father he claimed to be, I stated, looking back to the witness. He was actively bankrupting our family to build a hidden nest egg while I was deployed. That is correct, Colonel Vance confirmed. We tracked every single penny. His digital footprint was surprisingly easy to follow once we cracked the initial shell company. He used his personal work computer to initiate the majority of the transfers. I nodded, taking a moment to let the massive sum of money sink into the court record. $480,000 was a staggering amount to steal from a spouse. But I knew the investigation had uncovered something far worse. Something that would permanently destroy the untouchable reputation of the mighty Bradley Lawson. Agent Vance? I said, my voice dropping to a serious, calculated tone. You mentioned you tracked every single penny. Did you limit your investigation solely to the joint marital accounts shared by Mr. Lawson and myself? No, Colonel Vance replied, turning to the next page in his massive dossier. Standard forensic protocol requires us to verify the original source of all incoming funds before they are funneled offshore. We traced the financial pipelines completely backward to their absolute origin points. And what did you find when you traced those origin points? I asked, taking a step closer to the witness stand. Bradley suddenly stopped whispering to Caldwell. He froze, his entire body going rigid. The sweat was pouring down his face now, soaking the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He stared at Agent Vance with a look of absolute, unadulterated panic. We tracked the source of the hidden funds, Vance stated, leaning closer to his microphone, ensuring every word echoed with devastating clarity. And it seems Mr. Lawson was not just hiding his marital assets, he was stealing someone else's. The courtroom watched in dead silence. The digital timestamp ticked forward, painting an undeniably damning picture. In the foreground of the hospital security footage, the heavy double doors had swung completely shut behind my sprinting figure. But the entire focus of the room had now shifted exclusively to the background. There, sitting comfortably on a plush sofa in the waiting alcove, was Bradley. The contrast between his deeply relaxed posture and the critical emergency unfolding down the hall was physically sickening to witness. Through the thick glass observation window of the intensive care room, medical staff moved rapidly around the bed where our daughter lay. Lily was hooked to a tangled web of monitors, fighting through the terrifying, suffocating grip of severe pneumonia. Even without sound, the visual reality of her small chest heaving with violent coughing fits was agonizing to watch. Yet the security footage clearly shows Bradley standing in the hospital hallway, completely ignoring his coughing daughter. He did not press his face against the glass. He did not pace the corridor with frantic parental worry. He did not flag down a passing nurse to demand updates. Instead, he was screening himself from the medical chaos, leaning further back into the cushions, crossing his legs and holding his cell phone tightly to his ear. His handsome features were twisted into an ugly mask of pure irritation. He was gesturing wildly with his free hand, his mouth moving in rapid, angry bursts. He was obviously having a heated argument. The supposedly devoted father who had just wept on the witness stand claiming he had spent the entire night heroically holding the hand of his critically ill child was sitting 20 feet away, actively ignoring her existence. Instead, he is screaming at his mistress on the phone. I stepped away from the clerk desk and walked slowly to the center of the room. I kept my eyes fixed directly on the large screen holding Bradley accountable for every agonizing second of his recorded negligence. I waited until the entire courtroom had fully digested the undeniable visual reality of his abandonment before I spoke again. Your Honor. I said, my voice breaking the heavy, oppressive quiet of the room. The video footage alone clearly contradicts the sworn testimony the plaintiff just provided under oath. However, visual evidence only tells half the story of that night. I request permission to play the accompanying audio track. Richard Caldwell finally snapped out of his stunned paralysis. He jumped up from his leather chair, practically knocking it backward onto the floor. "Objection, Your Honor!" Caldwell shouted, his voice shrill and laced with absolute panic. "Hospital security cameras do not typically record audio. We cannot verify the source or the legality of this recording. It is highly prejudicial and a clear violation of state privacy statutes. I demand this exhibit be stricken from the record immediately." I did not look at Caldwell. I kept my gaze steady on Judge Reynolds, who was staring at the plaintiff lawyer with a look of barely concealed disgust. The audio was captured by the emergency room dispatch microphone positioned directly above the waiting alcove, Your Honor, I explained smoothly. It is standard procedure to record audio in that dispatch zone for liability purposes. The audio recovered legally from the hospital security system was fully authenticated. It was entered into the unsealed evidence folder sitting on your bench alongside the video file. Judge Reynolds looked down at the thick government dossier, then back up at Caldwell. His expression was cold and completely devoid of any sympathy for the crumbling lawyer. The evidence was legally obtained and properly submitted under federal authority. Mr. Caldwell, the judge said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. Your objection is overruled. You will sit down immediately. Caldwell slowly lowered himself back into his seat, putting his head in his hands. He looked like a man who finally realized his career was flashing before his eyes. On the witness stand, Bradley was physically trembling. He looked frantically at the exit doors as if contemplating a desperate run for freedom, but he was completely trapped. Judge Reynolds nodded to the young clerk. "Play the audio," he commanded. The clerk pressed a button on her keyboard, and a sharp burst of static crackled through the courtroom speakers, followed by the low, ambient hum of the hospital waiting area. Then the voice of Bradley Lawson echoed through the cavernous room loudly and crystal clear. There was no trace of the soft, gentle tone he had used moments ago to paint himself as a martyr. His recorded voice was harsh, whiny, and dripping with absolute selfish entitlement. "I am telling you, I cannot just walk out right this second." Bradley spat, his voice filling every corner of the courtroom. "The nurses are running around everywhere. I have to wait until they stabilize her, or someone will notice I am gone." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Several members of the jury physically recoiled, staring at the witness stand with pure, absolute disgust. But the audio recording was not finished. "No, you listen to me," the recorded voice of Bradley continued, his tone turning exceptionally vicious. "I don't care that the kid is sick. I already booked our tickets to Cancun. Do you know how much money I spent on that luxury resort? I am not losing my deposit just because Julia decided to vanish on another work trip. I will leave as soon as the doctor stops hovering. Just pack your bags and meet me at the airport terminal in an hour." The audio clicked off, leaving a deafening, heavy silence in its wake. The devastating reality of his abandonment hung heavily in the cold air, completely suffocating the plaintiff table. On the screen, the visual played out exactly as he had promised his mistress. Bradley abruptly stood up from the hospital sofa. He stuffed his expensive cell phone into his pocket and grabbed his heavy canvas bag from the floor. He did not walk over to the intensive care room to check on his daughter one last time. He did not speak to a single nurse or doctor to ensure she was stable. He simply turned his back on the pediatric ward, walked briskly down the brightly lit corridor, and pushed through the automatic exit doors. The footage then shows him leaving the hospital, abandoning 6-year-old Lily entirely. The atmosphere in this courtroom shifted dramatically from shocked disbelief to pure, unadulterated outrage. The jury box looked ready to riot. One of the female jurors was openly glaring at Bradley, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Another juror shook his head in absolute disgust, refusing to even look at the witness stand. Judge Reynolds sat perfectly still, his jaw set in a rigid line of fury. He stared at Bradley with a look of such profound contempt that it seemed to lower the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Bradley had tried to manipulate a federal judge by weaponizing the illness of an innocent child, and the judge was clearly ready to bury him for it. Bradley hunched over in the witness chair, wrapping his arms tightly around his stomach. He looked pathetic, small, and entirely broken. The tailored navy blue suit that had looked so commanding an hour ago now seemed like a cheap costume hanging off a coward. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of lie or excuse, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. His facade was completely incinerated. I turned away from the projector screen and slowly walked back toward the gallery partition. I ignored Bradley completely. He was a defeated man and he no longer mattered to me. Instead, I focused my entire attention on the woman sitting in the front row. Catherine Lawson was falling apart right in front of my eyes. The impeccable, arrogant posture she had maintained for years was completely gone. She was slumped forward, clutching the wooden barrier with trembling, manicured hands. Her breath was coming in short, sharp, ragged gasps. She had built her entire identity on the unshakable belief that her son was perfect and her family was legally untouchable. The reality of his absolute betrayal was physically destroying her. I stopped just a few short feet away from her, staring directly at the trembling matriarch. Julia turns to a hyperventilating Catherine. "He didn't stay by her bedside, Catherine," I stated, my voice remarkably smooth and razor-sharp. "He used the $15,000 you gave him for medical bills to fly his mistress to Mexico. Did he forget to mention that at Sunday dinner?" The silence that followed this declaration was absolute and suffocating. It was not the kind of quiet that comes from simple surprise, but the heavy, dense stillness that precedes a massive explosion. Even Judge Reynolds leaned forward, resting his forearms on the heavy oak bench, his eyes narrowing as he stared down at the federal agent. I watched as Special Agent Vance calmly turned to the next section of his massive dossier, carefully smoothing the thick pages flat. He did not notice the suffocating tension in the room. He simply continued doing his job, reading the unvarnished facts aloud for the official court record. "We initiated a secondary trace to locate the origin point of the $480,000 hidden in the offshore accounts," Vance explained, his deep voice echoing. "We initially assumed the plaintiff was merely draining marital funds. However, the mathematics did not align with his known corporate salary or the assets accumulated during your marriage. Therefore, we expanded the audit parameter." Vance paused and looked directly at the judge. "We discovered a direct link between the shell companies Mr. Lawson created and a private wealth management firm holding a generational trust fund. Specifically, the primary family trust belonging to his mother, Catherine Lawson." In the front row of the gallery, Catherine gasped audibly. Her hand flew to her chest, clutching the lapels of her designer jacket. She shook her head from side to side, her perfectly styled hair falling slightly out of place. "No," she whispered, the sound barely carrying past the wooden partition. "That is impossible. The trust is locked. He does not have authorization." Judge Reynolds ignored her outburst, keeping his focus entirely on the witness. "Explain the mechanism of the theft, Agent Vance," the judge instructed, his voice grave and demanding. "How does a man siphon nearly $500,000 from a secured generational trust without triggering massive alarms from the wealth management firm?" "He forged the primary authorization signatures." "Your Honor," Vance replied, turning another page and pulling out a series of enlarged, high-resolution photographs. "These are copies of the original wire transfer mandates submitted to the wealth management firm over the course of the last 36 months. As you can see, they all bear the signature of Catherine Lawson." However, our forensic handwriting analysis conclusively proves that these signatures are direct digital forgeries. Mr. Lawson utilized a sophisticated optical scanner to copy his mother's signature from a previous legal document. He then superimposed that exact signature onto 24 separate wire transfer requests, systematically bleeding the trust fund dry while keeping the transactions small enough to avoid triggering federal reporting thresholds. Catherine was gripping the wooden barrier in front of her so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. She was staring at the enlarged photographs of the forged documents, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and utter disbelief. She had spent her entire life protecting her son, shielding him from consequences, and bullying anyone who dared to question his perfection. She had sat in this very courtroom all morning, radiating arrogant confidence, wielding her wealth like a heavy club against me. But that wealth was the only thing giving her power, and now a federal agent was sitting on the stand methodically explaining how her beloved golden boy had robbed her blind. But the scope of the theft extends far beyond the $480,000 we located in the offshore accounts. Vance continued, his tone remaining clinical and detached. Once we gained access to the primary trust records, we discovered that the offshore accounts were simply a holding area for a much larger operation. Over the course of the last 3 years, Mr. Lawson has forged his mother's signature to authorize a total of 47 wire transfers. The total amount stolen from the Lawson Family Generational Trust Fund is $2,500,000. The number hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave, $2.5 million. Caldwell slumped forward in his chair, resting his forehead against the polished wood of his table. He looked like a man who was actively trying to wake up from a terrible nightmare. Bradley was completely paralyzed. He was staring straight ahead, unblinking, his mouth hanging slightly open as the absolute magnitude of his crimes was laid bare. "Where is the rest of the money?" Agent Vance, the judge, asked, his voice laced with a dangerous edge. "If only $500,000 is sitting in the Cayman Islands, what happened to the remaining $2 million? "He blew it entirely, Your Honor," Vance stated flatly. "Every last cent of it is gone." "Gone," the judge repeated, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. $2 million does not simply vanish, Agent Vance. Please clarify your statement for the official record. Mr. Lawson engaged in highly volatile, unverified cryptocurrency trading, Vance explained, pulling a thick stack of printed ledgers from his briefcase. He utilized the remaining $2 million to purchase a series of obscure, unregulated digital coins. Our analysis of his digital footprint indicates he was attempting to secure massive overnight returns. He joined several exclusive online trading groups and began making incredibly high-risk financial gambles. He was leveraging the stolen trust funds against massive margin calls in a desperate attempt to double his investment. Unfortunately for the plaintiff, the specific cryptocurrency markets he invested in experienced a total catastrophic collapse 8 months ago. The digital coins he purchased are now entirely worthless. The $2 million has evaporated into the digital ether. There is absolutely no way to recover those specific funds. They are permanently gone. I turned to look at Bradley, who was now silently weeping. The tears were streaming down his pale cheeks, pooling at the collar of his shirt. He had stolen his family fortune to play the part of a massive financial success, trying to impress a woman who only cared about the money he was spending on her. He had taken his mother's legacy and thrown it into a digital bonfire, all to fund his secret life and maintain the illusion of his own superiority. Furthermore, Vance continued relentlessly. The offshore accounts were actively being depleted to fund a secondary lifestyle. We traced hundreds of thousands of dollars in outgoing payments from the Cayman accounts. Mr. Lawson was purchasing luxury vehicles, high-end designer jewelry, and funding extensive international vacations. None of these purchases or vacations involved his wife or his daughter. We cross-referenced the travel itineraries and the luxury shipping addresses with a woman named Jessica Miller. Our investigation confirms that Mr. Lawson was actively draining the stolen trust funds to finance an elaborate, lavish lifestyle for his mistress. The Cancun trip referenced in the previous audio recording was entirely paid for using stolen money from Catherine Lawson. The realization finally hit Catherine like a massive runaway freight train. The pristine world she had built around herself was completely shattered. The immense wealth and power she had been using to threaten me all morning was entirely gone. Her family legacy, the generational money that had defined her entire existence, had been gambled away by the very son she had spent her morning defending. The Lawson dynasty was effectively bankrupt. They were ruined. And it was not my fault. It was not a bad investment by a financial advisor. It was the deliberate, malicious theft committed by her perfect golden child. The Lawson dynasty was effectively bankrupt, destroyed by the golden child she had spent her life protecting and enabling. The silence in the courtroom was suddenly broken by a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was a guttural, agonizing shriek of pure primal rage. It sounded like an animal caught in a brutal steel trap. I turned toward the gallery just in time to see Catherine Lawson completely snap. The refined, elegant socialite vanished in a split second, replaced by a woman consumed by absolute fury. Catherine lets out a guttural shriek, lunging not at Julia, but at her own son right in the middle of the courtroom. "You stole from me! You bankrupt us!" she screams, slapping Bradley across the face. The sharp crack of flesh striking flesh echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted courtroom. Catherine Lawson had swung her hand with every ounce of strength in her fragile frame directly into the cheek of her golden child. Bradley reeled backward from the force of the blow, stumbling over his own feet as he hit the heavy wooden panels of the witness stand. The heavy thud of his body against the wood seemed to break the spell of paralysis that had gripped the room. Total chaos immediately erupted. Catherine was screaming now, her voice a jagged, hysterical tear in the quiet atmosphere of the court. "You ruined us!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at his cowering form. "You stole everything your father built. You threw it all away for some cheap woman. How could you do this to your own family?" Bradley raised his arms defensively, shielding his face, as if he expected her to strike him again. "Mom, please!" he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Let me explain. I was going to pay it back. I was going to fix it." "You are a thief," Catherine howled, completely ignoring his desperate pleas. "You are a liar and a thief." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room swung open violently as two armed bailiffs rushed down the center aisle. They moved with swift, practiced authority, inserting themselves directly between the furious matriarch and the cowering witness. "Mom, you need to step back right now," one of the bailiffs commanded, grabbing Catherine by the elbow and physically restraining her from lunging at the stand again. Catherine fought against the grip of the bailiff for a brief second before the last remaining ounce of her energy completely evaporated. She collapsed against the wooden gallery partition, sobbing uncontrollably. Her entire world, the carefully curated illusion of superiority and wealth, had been incinerated in a matter of minutes. Amidst the screaming and the physical struggle unfolding at the front of the room, I noticed a quiet, methodical movement taking place at the plaintiff table. Richard Caldwell was completely ignoring his client. He was not rushing to defend Bradley or object to the chaotic scene. He was calmly packing his expensive leather briefcase. His movements were precise and deliberate. He gathered his gold-engraved pens, stacked his pristine legal pads, and slid them neatly into the bag. He snapped the golden latches shut with a sharp click that somehow cut through the noise of the room. Judge Reynolds had been watching the scene unfold with an expression of cold, calculating disgust. He grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down hard onto the sounding block. The loud crack silenced the room instantly. "Order in this court," the judge bellowed, his voice carrying a dangerous, absolute authority. "I will not tolerate a physical brawl in my courtroom. Bailiffs, secure the gallery. Mr. Lawson, remain exactly where you are." The bailiffs quickly guided a weeping Catherine back to her seat in the front row, standing firmly beside her to ensure she did not move again. Bradley lowered his arms, but remained frozen in the witness box, terrified to speak or even breathe too loudly. Judge Reynolds turned his furious gaze toward the plaintiff table. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said sharply, "control your client immediately." Richard Caldwell stood up from his heavy leather chair. He smoothed the front of his tailored suit and straightened his silk tie with absolute calm. He picked up his briefcase, holding it firmly by his side. "Your Honor," Caldwell began, his voice echoing clearly through the sudden dead silence of the room. "Due to the revelation that my client has provided fraudulent financial documents and perjured himself repeatedly under oath, I must immediately withdraw as counsel." Bradley snapped his head toward his lawyer, his eyes wide with absolute panic. "Richard, what are you doing?" Bradley hissed, desperately grabbing the edge of the witness stand. "You cannot leave me here. We have a contract." Caldwell did not even glance in his direction. He kept his eyes locked respectfully on the judge. "The ethical guidelines of the Bar Association are very clear, Your Honor." Caldwell continued smoothly. "I cannot in good conscience represent a client who has actively utilized my services to submit fabricated evidence to a federal court. I respectfully request permission to withdraw from this case effective immediately." Judge Reynolds stared down at the lawyer for a long, tense moment before giving a single slow nod. "Your request is granted, Mr. Caldwell," the judge said coldly. "I suggest you retain your own counsel regarding your failure to verify the evidence you submitted today, but you are dismissed from this proceeding." "Thank you, Your Honor," Caldwell replied. He turned on his heel and walked straight down the center aisle. He did not look at Bradley. He did not look at the sobbing Catherine. He walked out of the heavy wooden doors without a single backward glance, completely abandoning ship. Bradley watched his lawyer disappear, his mouth hanging open in silent horror. The reality of his isolation finally crashed down upon him. He was entirely alone. He turned his head slowly, looking toward the gallery. He sought out the one person who had always saved him, the one person who had always cleaned up his messes. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling with pathetic desperation. "Mom, please help me." Catherine slowly lifted her head. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her eyes swollen and red. She looked at the son she had worshipped her entire life. For the first time, there was no warmth or protection in her gaze. There was only pure, absolute revulsion. "You are dead to me," she stated, her voice a hollow, raspy whisper that somehow carried across the silent room. "You are no son of mine." She turned her head away, refusing to look at him any longer. Bradley shrank back into his chair, pulling his knees up slightly. The golden child of the Lawson dynasty was gone, leaving behind a terrified, exposed criminal standing completely alone amidst the ruins of his own staggering arrogance. Judge Reynolds picked up his gavel and slammed it down onto the block one final time. The sharp crack signaled the absolute end of any remaining patience the court had to offer. He leaned forward over the heavy oak bench, clasping his hands tightly together. He fixed his gaze entirely on Bradley. "Mr. Lawson!" The judge began, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. "In my 20 years on this bench, I have encountered many forms of deceit. I have seen men lie to save their money. I have seen men lie to save their pride. But what you have done in this courtroom today represents a level of malicious depravity that I find genuinely difficult to comprehend." Bradley swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing a slow path down his pale cheek. He tried to open his mouth to offer some pathetic excuse, but the judge raised a single hand, instantly silencing him. "Do not speak!" the judge commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "You will listen. You came into my courtroom and swore an oath before God and this state to tell the truth. You then proceeded to lie with absolute impunity. You attempted to strip a decorated military officer of her child, using fabricated evidence and malicious slander. You painted yourself as a devoted father while hiding the fact that you abandoned your critically ill daughter to fund a vacation with your mistress. And as if that staggering display of moral bankruptcy was not enough, you committed wire fraud. You stole millions of dollars from your own family to fund a secret life of extreme luxury. I formally deny your custody petition. I am awarding Julia sole physical and legal custody of Lily. I am stripping you of all visitation rights, pending a psychiatric and criminal evaluation." But Judge Reynolds did not stop at family law. "I am ordering the court clerk to forward Exhibit B, the financial dossier, directly to the FBI." "Mr. Lawson," the judge concluded, his voice turning utterly cold and completely dead, "I highly suggest you do not leave the state. The sharp crack of flesh striking flesh echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted courtroom. Catherine Lawson had swung her hand with every ounce of strength in her fragile frame directly into the cheek of her golden child. Bradley reeled backward from the force of the blow, stumbling over his own feet as he hit the heavy wooden panels of the witness stand. The heavy thud of his body against the wood seemed to break the spell of paralysis that had gripped the room. Total chaos immediately erupted. Catherine was screaming now, her voice a jagged, hysterical tear in the quiet atmosphere of the court. "You ruined us!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at his cowering form. "You stole absolutely everything your father built. You threw it all away for some cheap woman. How could you do this to your own family?" Bradley raised his arms defensively, shielding his face, as if he expected her to violently strike him again. "Mom, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Let me explain. I was going to successfully pay it all back. I was going to fix it. You are a disgusting thief," Catherine howled, completely ignoring his desperate pleas. "You are a terrible liar and a terrible thief." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room swung open violently as two armed bailiffs rushed down the center aisle. They moved with swift, practiced authority, inserting themselves directly between the furious matriarch and the cowering witness. "Ma'am, you need to step back right now," one of the bailiffs commanded, grabbing Catherine by the elbow and physically restraining her from lunging at the stand again. Catherine fought against the tight grip of the bailiff for a brief second before the last remaining ounce of her energy completely evaporated. She collapsed against the wooden gallery partitions, sobbing uncontrollably. Her entire world, the carefully curated illusion of superiority and immense wealth, had been permanently incinerated in a matter of minutes. Amidst the terrifying screaming and the physical struggle unfolding at the front of the room, I noticed a quiet, methodical movement taking place at the plaintiff table. Richard Caldwell was completely ignoring his panicked client. He was not rushing to furiously defend Bradley or loudly object to the incredibly chaotic scene. He was entirely focused on calmly packing his exceptionally expensive leather briefcase. His movements were precise and deliberate. He gathered his gold-engraved pens, stacked his pristine yellow legal pads, and slid them very neatly into the leather bag. He snapped the golden latches shut with a sharp, distinct click that somehow miraculously cut through the tremendous noise of the crowded room. Judge Reynolds had been watching the scene unfold with an expression of cold, calculating disgust. He grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down incredibly hard onto the solid-sounding block. The phenomenally loud, sharp crack silenced the chaotic room instantly. "Order in this absolute court!" The furious judge bellowed, his voice carrying a deeply dangerous absolute authority. "I will absolutely not tolerate a violent physical brawl in my courtroom. Bailiff, perfectly secure the gallery immediately. Mr. Lawson, remain exactly where you currently are." The armed bailiffs quickly guided a violently weeping Catherine back to her assigned seat in the front row, standing firmly beside her to ensure she did not physically move again. Bradley slowly lowered his arms, but remained entirely frozen in the witness box, too absolutely terrified to speak or even breathe too loudly. Judge Reynolds turned his furious, fiery gaze toward the plaintiff table. "Mr. Caldwell," the stern judge said sharply, "control your client immediately." Richard Caldwell stood up from his heavy leather chair. He smoothed the front of his tailored suit and straightened his silk tie with absolute calm. He picked up his briefcase, holding it firmly by his side. "Your Honor," Caldwell began, his professional voice echoing clearly through the sudden dead silence of the room. "Due to the shocking revelation that my client has deliberately provided entirely fraudulent financial documents and intentionally perjured himself repeatedly under oath, I must immediately withdraw as his legal counsel." Bradley violently snapped his head toward his lawyer, his bloodshot eyes wide with absolute blind panic. "Richard, what are you doing?" Bradley hissed desperately, grabbing the edge of the wooden witness stand. "You absolutely cannot leave me here. We have an ironclad contract." Caldwell did not even briefly glance in his client's direction. He kept his eyes locked respectfully on the judge. The ethical guidelines of the Bar Association are very explicitly clear, Your Honor. Caldwell continued smoothly. I cannot in good conscience represent a client who has actively utilized my professional services to submit fabricated evidence to a federal court. I respectfully request official permission to withdraw from this case effective immediately. Judge Reynolds stared down at the lawyer for a long, intensely tense moment before giving a single slow nod. Your specific request is granted, Mr. Caldwell, the stern judge said coldly. I strongly suggest you rapidly retain your own personal counsel regarding your total failure to officially verify the evidence you submitted today, but you are officially dismissed from this proceeding. Thank you, Your Honor, Caldwell replied. He turned on his heel and walked straight down the center aisle. He did not look at Bradley. He did not look at the sobbing Catherine. Caldwell walks out without a backward glance, leaving Bradley and Catherine entirely defenseless, standing alone amidst the absolute ruins of their own staggering arrogance. The heavy doors closed behind him with a final heavy thud. Bradley stared at the empty aisle, his mouth hanging open in a silent, terrible scream of pure despair. His high-priced savior had just publicly abandoned him. He slowly turned his head to look at his weeping mother. She refused to meet his desperate, terrified gaze. The absolute reality of his incredibly massive failure settled over his shoulders like an impossibly heavy, wet blanket. He was entirely broke. He was facing decades in federal prison. And the only people who had ever blindly protected him were either walking out the door or wishing he had never been born. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat, drawing the complete attention of the silent, terrified room. The total patience of this court has completely vanished, the judge stated, his voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly dangerous rumble. He looked at Bradley with a deep expression of utter, unadulterated disdain. You arrogantly came into my courtroom today and shamelessly lied under solemn sacred oath. You brought an innocent 6-year-old child into this malicious legal battle, attempting to weaponize her severe medical emergency for your own entirely selfish financial gain. You sat in that chair and produced fake tears to manipulate the very foundation of justice. You viciously attempted to strip a highly decorated military officer of her beloved child while simultaneously dragging her honorable name through the mud. You thought your inherited wealth and elite social status made you completely untouchable. You believed you could buy your way out of basic human decency, and you actively committed massive wire fraud right under my nose. The staggering scale of your malicious depravity is something I find genuinely difficult to even fully comprehend. Bradley weakly opened his mouth to offer some sort of pathetic, sniveling excuse, but the judge quickly raised a single hand, instantly silencing him. Do not attempt to speak, the judge commanded sharply. You will listen very closely to me. I am formally denying your completely fraudulent custody petition. I am awarding Julia full sole physical and absolute legal custody of Lily. I am permanently stripping you of all visitation rights, pending a comprehensive psychiatric and thorough criminal evaluation. You will absolutely not be allowed anywhere near that little girl until federal agents complete their extremely deep investigations. But Judge Reynolds did not just stop at simple family law. The severity of your malicious federal crimes completely demands a much higher authority. I am officially ordering the court clerk to immediately forward Exhibit B, the financial dossier, directly to the FBI. The federal government will absolutely not take kindly to this staggering level of unchecked financial deception. Mr. Lawson, I highly suggest you do not leave the state. Judge Reynolds brought his gavel down with a final thunderous crack that signaled the absolute end of the proceedings. We are adjourned, he announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality. He stood up from his heavy leather chair, gathered his black robes, and walked briskly out of the courtroom through his private chamber doors. The heavy tension in the room broke immediately, replaced by the chaotic shuffling of the gallery. The remaining spectators and reporters stood up, murmuring in hushed, shocked tones as they began filing out through the double doors at the back of the room. Special Agent Vance calmly gathered his massive financial dossier, snapped his briefcase shut, and walked out without giving them a single glance. Within minutes, the federal courtroom was completely empty, save for the shattered Lawson family and me. I stood quietly at the defense table packing my own notes. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of profound relief washing over my entire body. My daughter was finally safe. The nightmare was over. I zipped my bag shut and turned slowly, watching the absolute destruction playing out just a few feet away from me. Bradley had slowly pulled himself up from his chair. He was trembling violently, his expensive tailored suit clinging to his sweat-soaked frame. He looked completely shattered, entirely stripped of the arrogant smugness he had carried into this room just hours ago. He took a hesitant step toward his mother, who was still slumped over the wooden gallery partition. "Mom," Bradley whimpered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate plea. "Mom, please look at me. You have to help me. I am going to be arrested. We need to hire a top criminal defense attorney. You know the best lawyers in the city. You have to call them." Catherine slowly pushed herself up from the wooden barrier. The aristocratic facade she had meticulously maintained for decades was completely obliterated. Her immaculate hair was disheveled, her designer makeup was smeared across her pale cheeks, and her eyes burned with a wild, feral intensity. She looked at her golden child, not with the usual blind maternal devotion, but with pure, unadulterated revulsion. "With what money, you parasite?" Catherine shrieked, the sheer volume of her voice making Bradley physically flinch. "You took everything. You stole my entire legacy to buy cheap jewelry for your mistress. You bankrupted this family." "Mom, I can fix it," Bradley begged, reaching a trembling hand out toward her. "I just need a little help. I am your son." Catherine stepped back as if his proximity was physically repulsive. She stared at him with absolute disgust, and then, in a shocking display of complete contempt, she spat directly at his expensive leather shoes. "You are no son of mine," she snarled, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "You are a criminal and a fraud. You have ruined the Lawson name forever. I will not spend a single second of my life or a single breath trying to save you from a prison cell you completely deserve. You are entirely on your own. I disown you right here and right now. Never, ever speak to me again." Bradley let out a hollow, devastated sob, collapsing back into his chair and burying his face in his hands. He was officially a man without a country, completely abandoned by the only person who had ever enabled his pathetic behavior. Catherine turned away from him, her chest heaving with ragged, uneven breaths. She looked wildly around the cavernous, empty courtroom, her eyes darting from the empty judge bench to the heavy exit doors. She was a woman who had just realized she was completely desperate, entirely broke, and facing the absolute destruction of her entire social standing. Her gaze frantically swept across the room until it finally landed on me. I stood perfectly still, watching her process the reality of her situation. For years, she had treated me like dirt beneath her expensive designer shoes. She had mocked my military service, insulted my background, and repeatedly told me I was entirely unworthy of being part of her elite family. But now, stripped of her wealth and her power, she was looking at me like a lifeline. Catherine stumbled out of the gallery row, her designer heels clicking erratically against the polished floor. She practically ran across the aisle, closing the distance between us with desperate, frantic energy. "Julia," she gasped, reaching out and grabbing the sleeve of my navy blue blazer with both of her trembling hands. "Julia, please, you have to listen to me." I did not even step back. I stood my ground, looking down at her manicured fingers clutching my uniform jacket. I felt absolutely nothing for this woman. No pity, no sympathy, and certainly no desire to help her. "You have to do something," Catherine begged, her voice breathless and frantic. "You have that military salary. You have connections in the government. You can talk to someone. You can stop the FBI from investigating him. You have to use your clearance to shut this down before it goes public." For Lily's sake, Catherine pleaded, her grip tightening on my sleeve. "You cannot let her father go to federal prison. It would absolutely destroy her. She needs him. And you must help me save the house. The bank will foreclose on the estate if they find out the trust is empty. You have to give me a loan, Julia. Just until I can safely liquidate some assets, you owe it to this family to keep us afloat. I stared at her, genuinely amazed by her absolute delusion. Even now, after everything that had just happened, she still believed she could manipulate the world to serve her needs. I looked down at the woman who had spent years trying to make me feel incredibly small, entirely useless, and completely unworthy of a family. I remembered the sneers, the backhanded compliments, the deliberate attempts to isolate me from my own daughter. I remembered the moment she stood in my kitchen calling me a glorified filing clerk and demanding I hand over my child. I reached up slowly and deliberately. I placed my hand over her trembling fingers and peeled them off my jacket one by one. I did it with absolute precision, removing her frantic grip with cold, undeniable authority. I let her hands drop back to her sides, leaving her standing before me completely powerless. I looked directly into her frantic, tear-streaked eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I simply smiled at her. It was a cold, calculated smile of absolute total victory. I do not owe you a single thing, Catherine, I stated, my voice smooth and perfectly steady, and I highly suggest you stop attempting to desperately leverage my daughter to clean up the catastrophic mess you and your son created. Lily has one parent now. She will be absolutely fine. Catherine stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to comprehend my refusal. But the house, she whispered desperately. I will lose the estate. I have nowhere else to go. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my blazer. My fingers closed around the thick, crisp paper waiting inside. I pulled it out and held it up between us. It was the exact same heavy manila envelope Catherine had thrown onto my kitchen counter just a few short hours ago. Do you remember this, Catherine? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. You came into my home this morning and threw this at me. You told me it was a generous settlement. You told me to take the $50,000, walk away from my daughter, and disappear. You said I was completely outmatched and outclassed. Catherine stared at the envelope, her eyes wide with sudden, terrifying realization. She slowly shook her head, stepping backward. Well, I continued, taking a single deliberate step toward her. It turns out that $50,000 was written from a completely bankrupt account. Your golden boy was trying to pay me off with money he had already stolen from you. But since you are currently facing absolute financial ruin, I thought you might actually need this back. I carefully pulled the completely worthless $50,000 check from the heavy manila envelope and let it flutter slowly down to the cold, hard, polished floor right between us. Then I reached back into the inner pocket of my blazer and deliberately withdrew the thick, itemized invoice from my own personal attorney. I pressed the $85,000 legal bill flat against Catherine's heaving chest, forcing her to reflexively bring her violently trembling hands up to hold it against her heart. Remember what you told me this morning, Catherine? I asked, my voice steady and completely devoid of pity. Remember how you stood in my kitchen and said to take the money and walk away because I do not stand a chance against a dynasty? Catherine stared down at the exorbitant legal bill pressed against her designer jacket. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into the crisp white paper, but she could not seem to form a coherent sentence. Her mouth opened and closed, the haughty aristocratic matriarch completely replaced by a broken, terrified woman who had just watched her entire world vaporize. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us until I could smell the sharp underlying scent of panic beneath her expensive floral perfume. I leaned in, ensuring my next words were meant for her ears alone. The dynasty is dead, I whispered, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register that carried the weight of absolute finality. Use whatever pennies you have left to pay your own lawyer. And if you ever come near me or my daughter again, I will not need a courtroom to ruin you. I did not wait for a single response. There was nothing left for her to say, and nothing more I needed to hear. I turned sharply on my heel and walked away. The sharp, rhythmic click of my shoes echoed like a series of gunshots against the heavy wooden walls of the silent courtroom. I pushed through the large double doors at the back of the gallery, leaving Catherine clutching the invoice and staring blankly into the empty space I had just occupied. Stepping out of the federal courthouse felt like walking out of a dark, suffocating cave into the bright, crisp reality of the real world. The afternoon sun was shining brilliantly, casting long golden shadows across the stone steps. The oppressive, humid air of the courtroom was instantly replaced by a cool, refreshing breeze rolling off the nearby harbor. I took a deep, prolonged breath, filling my lungs with the clean air and letting the absolute magnitude of the victory wash over me. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, my shoulders relaxed. The heavy, invisible weight of constant anxiety, the persistent gnawing fear that the Lawson family wealth would somehow manage to tear Lily away from me, evaporated completely. It was finished. My daughter was entirely safe. Her future was permanently secure, and no amount of fabricated evidence or elite social connections could ever threaten us again. I walked slowly down the wide stone steps toward my parked car, my mind already jumping ahead to the quiet evening. I would finally pick Lily up from school, take her directly to her absolute favorite park, and watch her run freely across the green grass, without the constant looming dread of an impending custody exchange hanging over my head. I would happily cook her favorite dinner tonight and patiently read her an extra long bedtime story before tucking her securely into bed. We were finally entirely free to simply exist as a normal, genuinely happy family without their dark shadow. The justice system moved with surprising, terrifying speed when federal financial crimes were involved. The fallout from the courtroom revelations did not take months or years to materialize. The absolute destruction of the Lawson family played out over the next few incredibly chaotic weeks, unfolding like a brutal public spectacle that the entire city watched with morbid fascination. Bradley did not even attempt to return to his luxury apartment downtown. Knowing that the federal authorities were actively preparing an indictment based on the undeniable evidence presented in court, he panicked. He gathered whatever remaining cash he had on hand and fled to a cheap, dilapidated motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. He abandoned the tailored suits and the expensive sports cars, trading his elite lifestyle for a stained mattress and peeling wallpaper. His cowardly attempt at hiding was just as pathetic and terribly short-lived as his fraudulent custody battle had been. The highly trained federal agents, relentlessly tracking his financial digital movements, effortlessly located him in less than 48 hours, hiding like a frightened child. The local news stations broadcast the dramatic raid live, capturing the exact moment a team of heavily armed agents breached the flimsy door of room number 4. They led Bradley out into the harsh glare of the flashing police lights. He was wearing wrinkled sweatpants and a stained gray t-shirt, a stark contrast to the impeccable golden boy image he had maintained his entire life. His hands were secured tightly behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. He kept his head down, refusing to look at the surrounding cameras, his shoulders hunched in total profound defeat. He looked small, weak, and completely broken as the agents pushed him into the back of a dark federal transport vehicle. There were no high-priced lawyers waiting to bail him out. There was no mother to make the problem disappear. He was entirely alone, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence and the absolute certainty of a lengthy stay in a federal penitentiary. Catherine faced a completely different but equally devastating form of absolute ruin. The wealth management firm responsible for the generational trust fund moved immediately to lock down every single remaining asset connected to the Lawson name. They froze her personal bank accounts, suspended her platinum credit cards, and initiated aggressive legal proceedings to recover whatever stolen funds could possibly be salvaged. The sprawling historical estate that had served as the ultimate symbol of her aristocratic power was immediately seized by the bank. The foreclosure process was swift and entirely merciless. The massive iron gates were chained shut, and large, stark warning signs were posted across the pristine, manicured lawns. The local high society elite, the wealthy friends and influential connections Catherine had spent decades carefully cultivating, completely vanished overnight. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a family currently embroiled in a massive, highly publicized federal fraud scandal. When the bank ordered her to vacate the premises, she found herself entirely isolated. Her phone remained completely silent. The invitations to exclusive galas and charity dinners ceased immediately. The elite social circles she had ruled with an iron fist slammed their doors firmly in her face. On the morning she was officially evicted, there was no fleet of luxury moving trucks waiting to transport her belongings. There was no team of hired staff to carefully pack her expensive art collection or her antique furniture. The bank had claimed ownership of almost everything inside the home to offset the massive debts her son had incurred. She was strictly allowed by the court to take only her most basic personal clothing and a few simple absolute necessities packed hastily into cheap cardboard boxes. Catherine sat alone in the cramped cab of a rented moving van parked at the very end of the long, sweeping driveway. She watched through the dusty windshield as bank representatives formally changed the locks on the heavy mahogany front doors. The sprawling, majestic estate looked cold and imposing, completely indifferent to the shattered woman who had once claimed to be its absolute master. She sat there in the silence of the cheap rental vehicle, entirely abandoned by everyone she considered a peer. Her son was sitting in a federal holding cell. Her wealth was completely gone. Her social standing was utterly destroyed. She had spent her entire privileged life aggressively attempting to make everyone else feel incredibly inadequate and exceptionally small, and now she was the only one sitting totally alone in the cold shadows, entirely discarded and completely forgotten forever by the elite world she had foolishly worshipped. 3 months later, the brilliant morning sun beat down on the perfectly manicured parade field of the naval base. A crisp, salty breeze rolled off the water, snapping the heavy fabric of the flags lining the grandstand. The sky was an unbroken canopy of endless blue. There were no dark clouds looming on the horizon today. I stood at absolute attention near the center of the staging area, listening to the rhythmic crunch of polished boots against the pavement as the honor guard assumed their positions. The heavy fabric of my dress uniform felt perfectly tailored against my shoulders. The silver eagles resting firmly on my lapels gleamed brightly in the sunlight, reflecting the profound weight of my recent promotion to colonel. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, coastal air. The absolute stillness of this moment was a staggering contrast to the chaotic, suffocating darkness of the courtroom. The air here felt light and incredibly pure. Every single trace of the toxic venom that had permeated my life for the past decade had been thoroughly scrubbed clean. The Lawson name had completely faded into obscurity. Bradley was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary, awaiting a trial that would undoubtedly end in a massive sentence. His mother was entirely gone, swallowed up by the very poverty she had always openly despised. They were simply ghosts, now powerless shadows that could no longer reach out to hurt me or manipulate my daughter. We were finally safe. My focus remained locked straight ahead, but my peripheral vision caught the beautiful, vibrant energy of the crowd gathering in the pristine white folding chairs arranged on the grass. This was an invitation-only ceremony, an intimate gathering designed specifically to honor those who had demonstrated exceptional leadership and unwavering integrity under extreme pressure. As the base commander stepped up to the wooden podium to begin his opening remarks, my mind drifted briefly to the incredible transformation I had witnessed in my daughter over these past 90 days. The constant underlying anxiety that used to plague her small frame had completely vanished. She no longer woke up in the middle of the night terrified that she would be taken away to a cold, sterile mansion. Instead, she woke up laughing. Her pediatricians were absolutely amazed by her rapid physical and emotional recovery. Without the intense psychological stress her father had deliberately inflicted upon her, she had blossomed into a healthy, energetic, and fiercely independent little girl. We spent our weekends hiking through the dense green forests, baking messy, elaborate desserts in our kitchen, and building massive, complicated forts out of couch cushions. Our home was no longer a contested battleground. It was a true sanctuary filled entirely with warmth, safety, and unconditional love. The dark, oppressive weight of the custody battle had been completely lifted from her small shoulders, allowing her true bright personality to finally shine through without any hesitation or fear. The booming voice of the base commander echoed across the open field, bringing my attention sharply back to the present moment. He spoke eloquently about duty, about the profound necessity of protecting the vulnerable, and about the immense courage required to stand firm in the face of overwhelming adversity. As he read the official citation detailing my service record and the specific actions that had earned this high commendation, I allowed myself to slowly scan the front rows of the audience. There was absolutely no toxic mother-in-law glaring at me with veiled disgust. There was no cheating husband sitting with a perfectly practiced fake smile attempting to steal the spotlight. Instead, I was surrounded by my actual family. My true chosen family filled the seats. My loyal squad members, the men and women who had stood shoulder to shoulder with me in the most dangerous corners of the world, sat in the front row. They wore their dress uniforms with impeccable pride, their chests decorated with medals that told stories of immense sacrifice and absolute loyalty. They had never once doubted my integrity. They had never once questioned my character. They simply closed ranks and protected me when the entire world seemed to turn against me. Sitting right beside my executive officer was a face that brought an unexpected but deeply genuine smile to my lips. Judge Reynolds sat comfortably in a folding chair wearing a sharp dark suit instead of his heavy judicial robes. He had graciously accepted my personal invitation to attend the ceremony as a guest of honor. When our eyes met across the green lawn, the stern, formidable judge offered me a warm, deeply respectful nod. He was the man who had finally seen through the elaborate, expensive lies and decisively ended the nightmare. His presence here today was a profound testament to the ultimate triumph of absolute truth over staggering wealth and unchecked arrogance. He had witnessed the very worst of humanity in his courtroom, but today he was here to witness a celebration of honor and resilience. Beside him sat my closest mentors, the senior officers who had guided my career and shaped my leadership. They watched me with expressions of profound, quiet pride. This was the support system the Lawson family had foolishly believed they could effortlessly crush. They thought I was an isolated target, a lonely woman entirely outmatched by their massive bank accounts. They never understood the incredibly deep, unbreakable bonds forged through shared hardship and mutual respect. My chosen family did not care about designer labels or sprawling inherited estates. They cared about character, about showing up when things got terribly difficult, and about standing firmly on the side of justice, regardless of the personal cost. "Colonel Lawson, please step forward," the base commander instructed, his voice carrying a note of deep personal admiration. I stepped up to the podium, my boots hitting the wooden platform with sharp, precise clicks. The commander turned to face me, saluting sharply before stepping in to pin the commendation medal to my chest. He shook my hand firmly, leaning in slightly to speak over the applause that was beginning to ripple across the parade field. "You earned this, Julia," he said quietly, his voice full of genuine respect. "Your daughter has a mother she can truly be proud of." "Thank you, sir," I replied, my throat tight with overwhelming emotion. I turned to face the cheering crowd, stepping back and snapping a crisp, perfect salute. The applause swelled, growing louder and more enthusiastic as my squad members rose to their feet. The official dismissal was finally given, breaking the formal, rigid tension of the ceremony. The moment the command was issued, the crowd began to mingle and move toward the reception area. But I did not move. I stayed exactly where I was because I saw a tiny figure in a bright yellow floral dress breaking away from the front row. Lily was running across the manicured green grass as fast as her legs could possibly carry her. "Mommy!" she yelled loudly, her bright, cheerful voice cutting through the surrounding noise with absolute clarity. She collided heavily into me, wrapping her small little arms tightly around my legs and burying her face into the dark fabric of my uniform trousers. I immediately dropped to one knee, not caring in the slightest about creasing my immaculate uniform. I pulled her into a fierce, protective embrace, holding her tightly close to my chest. I kissed her forehead gently, knowing we were finally truly safe now. She was completely beaming, radiating pure, unadulterated joy, and looking at me with eyes full of absolute total pride. This single beautiful moment was worth every single horrible second of the long, brutal fight. I stood back up, lifting her effortlessly into my arms as my squad gathered around us, offering their warm congratulations and loudly celebrating our victory. I looked out over the sunny green field, taking in the wonderful faces of the absolutely amazing loyal people who had bravely stood by my side when everything looked incredibly bleak. They mistook my silence for weakness. They didn't understand that in my line of work, silence doesn't mean you're losing. It just means you're waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The story of Julia Catherine and Bradley serves as a powerful reminder that true strength does not always roar. Sometimes the most formidable power lies in quiet restraint, unwavering patience, and absolute integrity. When faced with toxic individuals who attempt to weaponize inherited wealth, social status, and malicious intimidation, it is incredibly easy to feel entirely outmatched and overwhelmed. However, as Julia brilliantly demonstrated, you do not need to lower yourself to their level of chaotic cruelty to emerge victorious. By maintaining her dignity and allowing the undeniable truth to systematically dismantle their fragile web of lies, she proved that genuine character will always outlast fabricated superiority. Furthermore, this narrative beautifully highlights the profound difference between the family we simply inherit and the family we intentionally choose. Legal ties and marital contracts do not automatically guarantee loyalty, fundamental respect, or authentic love. True family is consistently found in the people who stand fiercely by your side during your absolute darkest hours, who celebrate your personal victories without a shred of jealousy, and who offer unwavering support when the rest of the world turns its back. Julia found her permanent sanctuary, not in a sprawling cold estate, but in the unbreakable bonds forged with her chosen family, her military squad, her trusted mentors, and her beloved daughter. Ultimately, no amount of money or elite social standing can shield arrogant people from the devastating consequences of their own malicious actions. Please share your own incredible stories of resilience in the comments below. If you have ever had to bravely stand your ground against someone who vastly underestimated your quiet strength, or if you have walked away from a highly toxic situation to build a beautiful chosen family of your own. If Julia's journey resonated with you today, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with anyone who might need a gentle reminder that true power always comes from within.